had always liked hiking alone. There was something about being out in nature, away from the noise of the city, that helped me clear my mind. This trip was supposed to be simple. A weekend hike on a trail I had read about online, somewhere not too far from my town. I packed my backpack carefully the night before, making sure to include all the basics: water, snacks, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an extra layer of clothing. I had done enough hikes to know it was better to be prepared, even if it was just a day trip. The trailhead was about 2 hours from my house, tucked away in a forested area that looked like it hadn't changed much in decades. The drive there was peaceful. The road twisted through hills and fields, and the sun was bright, casting long shadows from the trees. I arrived early, before most people were out, and parked my car in a small dirt lot beside a wooden sign that listed the trail rules. The sign was faded, but I could still make out the warning to stay on marked paths and to be cautious of wildlife. I strapped on my backpack and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. The forest smelled like pine and damp earth, a smell I loved. I started walking on the dirt trail, which was wide and well-maintained at first. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the sunlight filtered through the tall trees, making patterns on the path. Birds chirped in the branches above, and every now and then, a squirrel darted across the trail. The first few miles were easy. The trail followed a gentle incline and curved around a small creek. I stopped a few times to drink water and take pictures of the scenery: tall ferns, wildflowers, and the occasional bright red berry. I felt good, light on my feet, and calm. After about 3 hours of walking, the trail started to get steeper. The path narrowed as it wound higher up the ridge. I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the trees in a low, steady roar. The air smelled colder here, and the sun was hidden behind thick clouds that had moved in unexpectedly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. That's when things started to feel off. I realized I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. Not a single hiker had passed me or crossed my path. I figured it was because of the weather. Maybe the gray clouds had scared people away. But still, it made the forest feel quieter, almost too quiet. The trail markers became less frequent. Usually, there were bright orange ribbons tied around branches or small wooden signs nailed to trees. Now, I had to stop and look carefully to find the next marker. At one point, I took a wrong turn without noticing it and ended up on a narrow path that led down toward a rocky slope. I stopped immediately and turned back, trying to find where I'd gone off course. I checked my map and compass. The map was old and didn't show every small trail, but it helped me get a general idea of where I was. I was supposed to stay on the ridge, but the trail I had found seemed to veer off to the side. The sky was growing darker. I decided to keep going but pay close attention to the markers. As the afternoon wore on, the weather got worse. A cold wind blew harder, and I felt the first drops of rain. I put on my rain jacket and quickened my pace. The trail became muddy and slippery. Tree roots stuck out from the ground, making it hard to keep my footing. At some point, I stopped and looked around. The trees here were taller and thicker, blocking most of the light. It was harder to see more than a few feet ahead. The rain made the forest smell even stronger: wet moss, dirt, and pine needles. I realized I had been walking for hours and the trail still looked unfamiliar. I started to worry. I looked at my compass again. According to it, I was supposed to be heading north, but the way the trail twisted and turned, I wasn't sure if I was on the right path anymore. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, took out my phone to check the GPS. No signal, just like I expected. That part of the forest was too remote. I put the phone away with a sinking feeling. The rain turned into a steady drizzle. The wind howled louder, making the branches creak above me. I heard a noise, something moving in the brush not far from where I sat. I froze and listened. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, my heart was pounding. I stood up and tried to find the trail again. I walked slowly, scanning the trees for the orange ribbons, but they were hard to spot in the dim light. The rain blurred my vision. After about 10 minutes, I saw a small blaze on a tree, a faded orange mark. Relieved, I followed it. The trail led upward, closer to the top of the ridge. The wind was brutal here, pushing against me and chilling me to the bone despite my layers. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap from behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. The trees swayed, and branches scraped against each other in the wind. The sound came again, closer this time, like heavy footsteps on wet leaves. I started walking faster, trying not to panic. I reminded myself that I was alone, in a forest where people came to hike, and that any animal nearby would probably run if it saw me. Then I realized something important. I had no idea how far I was from the trailhead or the parking lot. The map didn't show a clear distance, and my phone had no signal. The sun was almost gone, even though it was only late afternoon. I kept walking, following the faint trail markers. But the trail was twisting, and I was beginning to doubt if it would ever lead me out. The trees around me were dense, and the forest floor was covered in thick underbrush. As the daylight faded, the forest grew darker, almost like night had fallen early. I took out my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it ahead. The beam showed a narrow path lined by thick bushes and low branches. The wind rattled the trees, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. My muscles were aching, and I was thirsty and cold. I stopped again to check my supplies. I had some water left and a few energy bars, but I knew I needed to keep moving. Then the worst happened. I slipped on a muddy patch and fell hard against a rock. The impact hurt my right ankle badly. I lay still for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to tell if it was broken. It hurt a lot, but I could move my foot slightly. I decided to keep going slowly but carefully. I used my hiking pole to help support my weight and limped along the trail. Every step sent a sharp pain through my ankle, but I couldn't stop here. The forest was too dark, and I had no idea how far I was from help. The trail continued winding upward. I felt like I was walking in circles. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to move. I forced myself to keep going, despite the pain and fear that was creeping in. I told myself I could make it to the top of the ridge, and from there, maybe I could see a road or signal. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a small clearing. The wind had calmed a little. I scanned the horizon with my flashlight and was surprised to see a faint glow far off in the distance. It was a highway or a small town, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. Hope surged through me. I decided to rest for a few minutes, drink water, and eat a snack. Then I would head toward the glow, even if it meant leaving the trail. I sat down on a rock, taking deep breaths, trying to ignore the pain in my ankle. Suddenly, I heard voices, faint but definitely human voices. I stood up quickly, trying to see where they were coming from. The voices seemed to be coming from below the ridge, in the direction I had come from. I didn't see anyone, but the voices grew louder, clearer. They sounded angry, loud, and urgent. I felt a cold chill, not because of the weather, but because I wasn't expecting anyone to be out here, and the tone of the voices didn't feel friendly. I quickly put my backpack on and decided to move away from the voices, heading toward the distant lights. My ankle protested, but I forced myself to walk. The voices stayed behind me, growing fainter as I moved forward. I walked for what felt like forever, stumbling through thick bushes, trying to keep the faint light ahead in sight. My flashlight was running low on batteries, and my water was nearly gone. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw the outline of a road. It was narrow and dark but real. I followed it slowly, limping and exhausted. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the forest stayed silent behind me. After nearly 2 hours, I reached a small gas station at the edge of the road. The lights were on, and a few cars were parked outside. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. The warmth and smell of gasoline and coffee hit me immediately. Inside, the clerk looked surprised to see me, wet, muddy, and limping badly. Without saying anything, I asked if I could use the phone to call for help. After a few calls, I arranged a ride and medical attention. Later, at the hospital, I learned my ankle was badly sprained but not broken. I was lucky. When I told the doctors about the hike, they warned me about that trail. Apparently, people had gotten lost there before. The forest was dense, the markers faded, and the weather changed quickly. the voices. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything: work, noise, people, and just be alone in the woods for a few days. I'm not the kind of person who camps with groups or likes loud places. Hiking alone gave me space to think, to clear my mind. I wanted that kind of quiet, but what I didn't expect was how much a place can feel alive in ways you don't want it to. I picked a trail deep in the mountains, a place not many people go. It wasn't famous or marked on all the hiking apps, but that was exactly why I chose it. I wanted to go somewhere untouched, to feel like I was really out there, away from everything. I packed my bag carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, and a good knife. I wore comfortable boots and clothes that could handle the cold nights and warm days. I left my phone with low battery and a GPS tracker, just in case. My family didn't really approve of me going alone, but I assured them I'd check in every evening. The drive to the trailhead was long and winding. The road narrowed as I got closer, surrounded by thick trees and steep hills. When I arrived, there was a small parking lot with only a few cars. I felt a bit of relief that I wouldn't be completely alone but still far from crowds. I double-checked my pack, put on my hiking hat, and set off on the trail just after sunrise. The air was cool and smelled like pine and earth. The path was narrow, dirt and roots winding through thick forest. Birds sang overhead, and small animals rustled in the bushes. At first, it felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles went smoothly. I enjoyed the rhythm of walking, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the occasional snap of a twig. The forest opened up here and there, revealing glimpses of the mountains covered in green and the blue sky above. I stopped for water and snacks under a large oak tree, feeling refreshed. As I went deeper, the trail got steeper and the trees grew taller and closer together. The sunlight barely reached the ground through the thick canopy, making the forest floor dark and cool. I felt a strange chill even though it was still early afternoon. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the shade. About 3 hours in, I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been clear and easy to follow, suddenly looked less maintained. Branches and bushes started to grow over the path, making it harder to walk. I stopped and looked around but didn't see any markers or signs for a while. The GPS said I was still on the right track, but the path was almost disappearing. I kept going, stepping carefully over roots and pushing through low branches. The woods felt quieter now, the birds stopped singing, and the animals seemed to have vanished. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone or something, but there was no one. By late afternoon, the trail became almost a narrow game path, barely wide enough for one person. I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers for hours. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to calm myself by thinking about my campsite, which I had planned near a small creek I had passed earlier on the map. The trees around me grew even denser. I noticed broken branches on the ground, like something heavy had been dragged through. There were strange marks on some trees, deep scratches like claws or tools. I felt a nervous knot form in my stomach. I wasn't sure what made me more uneasy: the isolation or these signs that I wasn't the first one here, maybe not even alone. I kept moving, stepping carefully. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot slipped on loose dirt, and I tumbled down a small slope, hitting a rock. Pain shot through my left ankle and I gasped. I sat for a moment, testing the weight on my ankle. It hurt badly, but I could still move my foot. I realized I'd sprained it. Panic started to rise. I was hours from the trailhead, and the injury made every step painful. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS. The signal was weak, almost gone. I tried calling for help, but the call wouldn't go through. I forced myself to breathe deeply, not to let fear take over. I looked around for a place to rest and set up my tent for the night. I found a small clearing near a cluster of ferns and started unpacking. My hands shook a little as I set up the tent. I poured some water, ate a little, and wrapped my ankle tightly with a bandage from my first aid kit. The forest around me felt alive with noises I hadn't noticed before: the rustle of leaves, distant snaps of branches, and a low, constant hum like wind, but no wind was blowing. I listened carefully, feeling the weight of the woods pressing in. I realized I hadn't heard any human voices since morning. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise made me jump. The shadows of the trees outside looked like moving shapes in the tense light. I tried to focus on my breathing and remind myself that nothing supernatural was happening. But my mind played tricks, and I felt like something was watching me, waiting. The next morning, I woke early, stiff and sore. My ankle was swollen and painful, but I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to make it out. I packed quickly and set off slowly, using my hiking poles to support my weight. I kept the GPS app open, following the trail as best I could. Hours passed. My ankle hurt worse with every step, and the forest didn't seem to change. The path became rocky and uneven. I stumbled several times and had to stop to rest. Hunger and thirst started to gnaw at me, but I didn't dare stop long. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone or something. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed the left path going toward a small river and a main road, the right path leading deeper into the wilderness. I paused, exhausted and unsure. I didn't want to go deeper, but the left trail was faint and overgrown. The right looked clearer, but it was the wrong way. I decided to take the left path, hoping it would lead me to water and maybe a way out. The bushes were thick, and I had to push through branches that scraped my arms. I moved slowly, one painful step at a time. The sun was high, but the canopy was thick, and I could barely see the sky. Suddenly, the ground gave way under me again. This time, I fell into a shallow pit hidden by leaves and branches. I hit my side hard and gasped, the pain sharp in my ribs. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to move. I wasn't seriously hurt, just bruised and sore. I looked up and saw that the pit was part of an old animal trap or a collapsed hole covered by branches and leaves. I realized I'd been lucky not to break anything. It made me more cautious, knowing there might be other traps or dangers hidden on the trail. After climbing out carefully, I pressed on, more alert now. I noticed the forest had a strange smell, something damp and earthy but with a sharp, sour edge. It made me feel sick to my stomach. I stopped and breathed deeply, but the smell lingered. By late afternoon, I heard the sound of running water. My heart lifted. I followed the sound and soon found a narrow river cutting through the forest. The water was clear and cold. I knelt and drank, letting the cold water soothe my dry throat. I sat by the riverbank for a while, resting my ankle and eating some of my food. I thought about my options. The map showed a logging road a couple of miles downstream. If I could follow the river, maybe I'd find the road and get help. I packed up and started moving along the river's edge. The terrain was uneven and slippery with moss and wet rocks. My ankle hurt with every step, and I slipped a few times, barely catching myself. But I kept going. As evening approached, I saw signs of human activity. A discarded soda can, tire tracks in the mud. Hope surged through me. I was close to the road. Then, out of nowhere, I heard voices. Quiet at first, then clearer. Men's voices, rough and low. I froze, my heart pounding. The voices were coming from up ahead, somewhere hidden in the trees. I crouched behind a fallen log and listened. The voices were talking about cutting timber, arguing over something. I felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. I was close to people, but they didn't know I was here. I decided to move quietly toward the sound, hoping to find the logging road and maybe hitch a ride or call for help. I stayed low, moving slowly. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, and I heard footsteps coming my way. Panic hit me. I scrambled up the slope away from the river, limping badly, trying to hide. I found a thick patch of bushes and crouched inside, barely breathing. The men's voices grew louder as they passed near my hiding spot. I heard a twig snap nearby and held still. After what felt like hours, the voices faded into the distance. I stayed hidden until it was dark, then moved cautiously toward the road. When I finally saw the dirt logging road under the moonlight, I felt tears in my eyes. I dragged myself onto the road and began walking along it, hoping to find a truck or a cabin. After a long, painful walk, I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms frantically until the truck stopped. The driver was an older man who looked surprised to see me but immediately called. I decided to go hiking alone in a forest I had never been to before. It was early autumn, the kind of weather where the air is cool but not cold, and the leaves on the trees are just starting to change colors. Reds, yellows, and oranges flickering in the sunlight. I wanted to get away from everything for a few days, to clear my head and just be alone in nature. I packed my backpack carefully the night before. I brought a tent, sleeping bag, some extra clothes, water bottles, a small stove, some canned food, a first aid kit, a map, a compass, a flashlight, and a fully charged phone. I also made sure to tell my friend where I was going and when I planned to be back. I even set a check-in time, which was 2 days later. I wanted to be responsible, but I also wanted to disconnect. The trailhead was a small dirt path in the middle of nowhere, about 2 hours from the nearest town. When I arrived early in the morning, the parking lot was empty except for one rusty pickup truck. I locked my car and started walking. The air smelled fresh. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or rustling of leaves. The path was narrow and uneven, with roots and rocks sticking out, but well marked with small wooden signs nailed to trees. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail climbed steadily through the woods, winding around small streams and over fallen logs. I stopped a few times to take pictures of the colorful leaves and to drink water. The sun was bright and the sky was clear. I felt good, relaxed, and a little excited to be out there alone. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a creek. I decided to take a longer break. I found a flat rock by the water and sat down. I ate some granola bars and sipped water, listening to the gentle flow of the creek. The sunlight filtered through the trees and warmed my skin. It was peaceful. After the break, I continued on the trail. The path became steeper and rockier, and the forest denser. The trees grew taller and closer together. I noticed fewer signs of animals, no squirrels or birds this far in. The silence was thicker, almost heavy. By late afternoon, I realized I had been hiking longer than I expected. The sun was getting lower. I looked at my map and compass to figure out where I was. The trail was supposed to loop back towards the parking lot in about 2 more miles, but I saw something strange. The trail markers became less frequent, and the path looked more worn and wild. I thought maybe I missed a turn. I stopped to check the map again. That's when I noticed a faint side path leading off the main trail. It was narrower and less maintained, but it seemed to head towards a ridge where the map showed a viewpoint. I decided to take the side trail. I thought it would be a good spot to see the sunset and set up camp nearby. The side trail was tougher. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and branches, and it was easy to lose the path. I had to stop several times to find the markers, which were small and faded. The forest felt darker and colder here, even though the sun was still out. The trees were mostly tall pines, with thick trunks and needle-covered branches. The scent of pine filled the air, mixed with damp earth and moss. I kept going, but after about an hour, the trail disappeared entirely. There was no clear path, just a steep slope covered with loose rocks and fallen trees. I looked around, trying to find the way back, but everything looked the same: trees, rocks, and shadows. I pulled out my compass again. I was supposed to go northeast to reach the viewpoint, but the terrain was impossible to cross in that direction. I started to feel uneasy. The sun was now low, and I could hear the faint sound of wind through the trees, but no birds or animals. I realized I had been off the marked trail for too long, and I was lost. I tried to stay calm. I looked at my phone to see if I had signal. No service. Put it away. I decided to backtrack carefully, trying to find the side trail again. I moved slowly, checking the ground for footprints or broken branches, signs of where I came from. It was difficult. The forest was thick and uneven. The light was fading quickly. After what felt like an hour, I finally spotted a small tree with a faded blue mark, the side trail marker. I felt a small relief. I followed the marker downhill, hoping to find the main trail, but the path was slippery, and the loose dirt made my footing uncertain. I slipped a couple of times, almost falling. Then I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too regular. A snapping of twigs, like footsteps. Not close, but definitely there. I stopped and listened. The sound was coming from behind me, moving slowly through the trees. My heart started to race. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything. I quickened my pace, trying not to panic. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps kept following me, matching my speed and direction. I glanced back again, but still nothing visible. I kept walking, now almost jogging, with my eyes scanning the forest. The light was almost gone. My flashlight was in my backpack, but I was afraid to stop and take it out. The footsteps were getting closer. I decided to run downhill towards where I remembered the main trail should be. The ground was rough and I stumbled a few times. The sound behind me was louder now, with the cracking of branches and rustling of leaves. I felt a cold sweat on my back. Suddenly, I tripped and fell hard on the dirt. My knee scraped badly, and I felt a sharp sting. I tried to get up quickly, but my leg hurt, and I was weak from panic and exhaustion. The footsteps were just a few yards behind me now. I grabbed my backpack and pulled out my flashlight. I clicked it on and shone the beam towards the dark trees. The beam caught something moving quickly between the trunks. A person, wearing dark clothes and a hood, moving silently but fast. I screamed and scrambled to my feet. I started running again, even though my leg hurt badly. The footsteps behind me stopped for a moment. I looked back with the flashlight. The figure was standing still, watching me. I ran towards the main trail, the only way I knew to get out. I kept shining the light behind me, but the figure did not follow. After a few minutes, the forest seemed to open up, and I recognized the main path. I collapsed onto a log, breathing hard, trying to stop shaking. I knew I had to keep moving before dark, but my knee was bleeding and swollen. I pulled out my first aid kit and cleaned the wound as best as I could. I put on a bandage and wrapped it tight. I decided to take slow, careful steps along the main trail, hoping to reach my car before nightfall. The sun disappeared completely as I walked. The forest grew colder and darker. I switched on my flashlight and kept it pointed at the ground ahead. I moved slowly, listening to every sound. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. After about an hour, I finally heard the sound of a car engine. I followed the sound and soon saw the parking lot lights through the trees. Relief flooded me. I limped quickly towards my car and unlocked it. I sat inside, locked the doors, and tried to calm down. I called my friend to tell them I was safe, but that I had gotten lost and hurt. They promised to come get me in the morning. I stayed in the car all night, shivering and exhausted. The next day, my friend arrived with help. We drove to the hospital where they treated my knee. The doctor said I would be fine with some rest and physical therapy. I never went back to that forest. I learned that nature can be beautiful but also unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of real people and real risks. From then on, I always stuck to marked trails, carried extra supplies, and trusted my instincts. I understood the importance of being prepared and cautious when alone in the wild. The experience stayed with me, not as a scary ghost story, but as a reminder to respect the outdoors and the people who share it. For not everyone you meet in the woods is friendly. I never forgot the feeling of being hunted, of helplessness when injured and alone, and how much relief it was to find safety at last. I had been looking forward to this hike for months. It was supposed to be a solo trip to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city and everything that weighed me down. The forest I chose wasn't some popular trail. It was deep in the mountains, a less traveled path I found on an old hiking forum, somewhere people went for solitude, away from crowds. The kind of place where cell service is spotty or non-existent. Perfect for what I wanted. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from my apartment. I left early in the morning before sunrise, packing my backpack with the usual essentials. Water, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map printed from the internet, a compass, a multi-tool, and a lightweight tent. I also had my phone and a small power bank, though I didn't expect to get any signal once I was deep in the woods. Driving up the winding mountain roads, I watched the sky brighten slowly. Birds began their morning songs, and the air was cool and fresh. I parked at the small lot near the trailhead and double-checked my gear. The place was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a creek. I locked my car and started walking. The first part of the trail was easy. Wide dirt path, gentle slopes, and the sunlight filtering through tall pine trees made the forest look peaceful and inviting. I had been hiking before, but not alone for this long. I felt a thrill of independence. I liked being on my own, away from people, just me and nature. About 2 hours into the hike, the trail narrowed and grew less obvious. The ground was covered in pine needles, and fallen branches made the path tricky to follow. I stopped often to check my map and compass. The forest was dense here, huge trees with thick trunks, underbrush that sometimes scratched my legs as I moved through. The smell of damp earth and pine sap was strong. I heard birds occasionally and saw squirrels darting in the bushes. I felt calm, focused. This was what I came for. Around midday, I reached a small clearing by a stream. The water was cold and clear. I took off my pack, drank some water, and ate a sandwich. Sitting on a rock, I listened to the gentle rush of water, thinking about the long hours ahead. After resting for about 30 minutes, I refilled my bottle and continued. The trail grew steeper and rockier. My boots crunched on loose stones as I climbed higher. Sweat dripped down my face despite the cool air. I took small breaks to catch my breath and drink water. The forest was silent except for the wind in the branches. I realized then that no one else was out here. Not a single hiker, no distant voices, no footprints besides mine. It was completely isolated. The sun started to lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows. I decided to find a spot to set up my tent before it got too dark. After about another hour, I spotted a small flat area off the trail. It was surrounded by trees but open enough to let in some light. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles and dry leaves, perfect for pitching my tent. I hurried to set it up before dusk, fumbling a bit as the light faded. By the time the tent was secure, the sky was turning orange and pink. I had a little camp stove and boiled water for some instant noodles. Eating in the dim light, I felt a small satisfaction in my simple meal. As night fell, I zipped up the tent and turned on my flashlight to check my map again. The forest outside was dark and thick. The sounds of the night started slowly, insects chirping, leaves rustling with the wind, the occasional crack of a twig somewhere far off. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the forest sounds, trying to relax. Then the unease began. It was subtle at first. A strange silence had settled. The insects stopped chirping. The rustling stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual night sounds vanished. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal. But then, a faint sound started. Not loud, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone tapping their fingers on a tree trunk. I shone my flashlight outside the tent, scanning the dark trees, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I waited. My heart beat faster. Then, from a different direction, I heard a crunch, footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not far, maybe a few dozen feet away. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter. No one should be here. I was alone. I switched off the flashlight and stayed still, listening. The footsteps moved closer, then paused. Then, after a long silence, they retreated slowly, crunching over leaves and twigs. My mind raced. Could it be a wild animal? A deer or a bear? But the slow, deliberate footsteps didn't fit. It sounded human. Someone was out here in the woods, walking near my tent in the dark. I felt exposed and vulnerable. My tent was thin, not much protection. I wondered if I should call out or make noise to scare off whoever it was, but I didn't want to attract attention either. I pulled out my pocket knife, gripping it in my hand, and tried to steady my breathing. For the next hour, I stayed awake, eyes wide in the dark, listening for any sound. But nothing else came. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My body was tense, but I forced myself to calm down. I packed up quickly, wanting to get away from that spot. I retraced my steps on the trail, checking behind me often, but no sign of anyone else. The forest looked normal in daylight. The sun warmed the trees, birds sang, and the fresh scent of pine filled the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me, watching. I pressed on, determined to finish the hike and get back to my car. The trail grew tougher. I had to scramble over fallen logs and navigate narrow ridges. The weight of my pack made every step harder. After several hours, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, I needed to take the left path to reach the parking area. I followed it, but the path soon became less clear. The dirt was soft and covered with fresh leaves, making footprints hard to see. I checked my compass again and again, making sure I was headed the right way. Suddenly, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees around me all looked the same, tall pines stretching endlessly. The sun was high, but the forest blocked much of the light. My map was confusing here. The trail wasn't marked well. Panic began to rise. I tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths and thinking logically. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself. The trail should have been downhill to the parking lot, but I didn't see any signs of a path. I backtracked a little but only found more undergrowth and fallen branches. Hours passed, and I wandered in circles. My water supply was running low. I drank slowly, rationing what I had left. My stomach growled, but I tried to ignore it. I had some energy bars but was saving them for later. The sun began to dip toward the horizon again. I realized I was lost. The weight of the day, the fear, and exhaustion hit me all at once. My legs were sore, my pack felt heavier than ever, and the reality of being alone and lost in the wilderness settled in. I knew I had to find a safe place to spend the night. I found a small clearing and set up my tent again, though my hands trembled as I worked. The forest at night wasn't friendly. I heard the distant howl of coyotes and the rustling of unseen creatures. I forced myself to eat some food and drink water. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept my knife close and flashlight ready. The next morning, I resolved to keep moving. I decided to follow a nearby stream I heard, hoping it would lead to civilization. The trek along the stream was slow. The banks were slippery, and I had to avoid thorny bushes and fallen trees. My feet got wet and cold from crossing the shallow water. After hours of following the stream, I saw signs of human presence. A broken fence post, an old trail marker half buried in moss. My hope grew. Eventually, I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road. I recognized it from my map. It was a logging road used by trucks, not popular with hikers, but at least it was a path. I started walking along the road, hoping to find a ranger station or a place where someone might be working. Late afternoon, I saw a small cabin at the edge of the woods. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. I hesitated but walked toward it. An elderly man opened the door. He looked surprised but friendly. I explained I was lost and needed help. He gave me water, food, and a place to rest for the night. He said the forest around here was dense and confusing and that many hikers had gotten lost recently because of trail damage from a storm. The next day, with his help, I was able to get a ride back to my car. Driving down the mountain road, I felt relief flood over me. I had survived the ordeal, lost and alone, facing fear and exhaustion. I learned a lot from that trip, how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness, how important it is to be prepared, and how strong the human spirit can be when faced with danger. Most of all, I learned to respect the forest, not as a mystical place full of ghosts or monsters. I have always loved hiking. There is something about walking through the woods, surrounded by trees and silence, that feels peaceful to me. The fresh air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the way the light filters through the branches. It all makes me feel calm and free. But the trip I'm about to tell you about changed the way I look at hiking forever. It was a trip I had planned for weeks, and I thought it would be a relaxing getaway. Instead, it turned into one of the scariest experiences I have ever had, and it lasted long after I left the trail. I picked a trail that was well known but not very busy. It was in a national forest several hours from my home. The forest was large, with a mix of pine and hardwood trees, and the trail promised a loop that would take me past a small lake and then up to a ridge overlooking a valley. The whole hike was supposed to be about 10 miles, and I figured I could do it in a day. I packed my backpack carefully: water, food, a map, a compass, a flashlight, first aid kit, and a knife. I wore my usual hiking boots and clothes. I told a friend where I was going and when I expected to be back. I felt prepared. The morning of the hike, the sun was just starting to rise when I arrived at the trailhead. The air was cool and smelled like pine needles and wet earth. A few cars were parked nearby, but not many. I strapped on my pack, double-checked my gear, and started walking. First, the trail was easy. The path was wide with clear signs marking the way. Birds were singing, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I felt happy and relaxed. It was the kind of quiet that lets you think, and my mind wandered freely as I walked. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed and started to climb gently. I could hear a small stream nearby, and I stopped to fill my water bottle at a little spring that bubbled out from the rocks. The water was cold and fresh, and I drank deeply. I noticed some wildflowers growing near the spring, tiny purple ones and some white ones that looked like little stars. I took a small break, eating a granola bar and watching a squirrel scamper up a tree. The sun was higher now, filtering through the canopy in warm golden patches. After the spring, the trail went into a thicker part of the forest. The trees were taller and closer together, and the ground was covered in fallen leaves and pine cones. I could hear the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. There was less light here, and the forest felt deeper, quieter. The trail itself was harder to follow. Some spots were muddy, and others were blocked by fallen branches. I had to step carefully and sometimes push aside small trees to get through. I reminded myself to pay attention to the markers on the trees, small orange paint marks, so I wouldn't get lost. As I walked, I noticed that the forest around me felt different. It wasn't the calm peace from earlier. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I thought maybe it was because I was getting higher up the ridge and the trees were thicker. Still, I felt a little uneasy. I looked at my map and compass to make sure I was still on track. The markers matched the map, so I felt reassured. After another hour, I reached a small clearing. From here, I could see the lake I had planned to visit. It was about a quarter mile below, surrounded by trees, and the sunlight sparkled on the water. I decided to head down to the lake to rest and eat some lunch. The path to the lake was steep and rocky, and I took it slowly. My legs felt tired from the climb, and my backpack seemed heavier as the day warmed up. The lake was quiet and still. I sat on a large rock by the shore and took off my boots to cool my feet in the water. The water was cold but refreshing. I ate my sandwich and a few pieces of fruit while watching dragonflies dart across the surface. I felt better here, near the water, away from the thick forest. After resting, I put my boots back on and prepared to head back up the ridge for the final stretch of the hike. The climb from the lake was tougher than I expected. The trail was narrow and covered in loose stones. I had to use my hands to steady myself in some places. My legs burned with effort, and sweat dripped down my face. The sun was high, and the forest canopy did not offer much shade. I took frequent breaks to catch my breath and drink water. As I neared the top of the ridge, I started to hear noises that didn't fit the peaceful forest sounds from earlier. There were rustling noises, louder and closer than the wind or animals I had heard before. It sounded like something was moving through the brush nearby. I stopped and listened, trying to tell where it was coming from. The noises moved around me, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right. I couldn't see anything, but the sounds made me tense. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. I wasn't in a place known for bears or mountain lions, and I had made enough noise with my steps that any animal would have run away. Still, the noises kept following me as I climbed. It felt like eyes were watching me from the trees. I pulled out my knife from my pack and held it loosely in my hand, feeling comforted by the weight. Finally, I reached the top of the ridge. The trees opened up, and the valley below stretched out before me. The view was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in trees, a river winding through the valley floor, and the sky stretching wide and blue. I stood there for a few minutes, catching my breath and taking it all in. But then I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the ridge, near a stand of trees, there was a small clearing I hadn't seen on the map. It looked like an old campsite, with a few charred logs arranged in a circle and a metal canister lying on its side. The clearing looked like it hadn't been used recently, but there were signs of people. Some footprints in the dirt, broken branches, and scraps of paper. The paper looked old and weathered, but I didn't get close enough to read it. The campsite gave me a weird feeling. It was out of place, as if someone had been there but didn't want to be found. I looked around carefully, but there was no sign of anyone now. The forest was still and quiet again. I decided to keep moving, not wanting to stay near the campsite longer than I had to. As I followed the trail along the ridge, the rustling noises started again, louder and closer. I felt my heart speed up. The forest felt darker here, even though it was still early afternoon. The trail was less clear, and I had to push through thick bushes and low-hanging branches. I could feel scratches on my arms from the branches as I moved. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack behind me, like a heavy branch breaking. I stopped and turned quickly, shining my flashlight toward the sound even though it was still daylight. There was nothing there, just the empty forest. My skin prickled and I swallowed hard. I told myself to stay calm and keep moving. The trail began to descend steeply now, winding down the side of the ridge. The ground was loose dirt and gravel, and I had to be careful not to slip. I moved slowly and carefully, eyes scanning the trees and bushes on both sides. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The footprints near the campsite weren't just old. They were fresh, and they weren't going away from the campsite. They led down the ridge the same way I was going. The prints were large, and the shoe tread looked like it belonged to a heavy boot. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe a ranger or another hiker had passed this way recently. But then the footprints stopped suddenly near a large fallen tree that blocked part of the trail. The tree was thick and heavy, lying across the path at an angle. I had to climb over it to keep going. I climbed over the tree, careful not to lose my balance, and when I landed on the other side, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. The sounds I had heard before were gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. I stopped for a moment, breathing hard, and looked around. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I wished I hadn't come this far alone. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. I checked my map. I was still on the right trail, but I was farther from the trailhead than I wanted to be. The sun was starting to move lower in the sky. I started walking again, trying to keep my mind focused. The trail twisted through the forest, and I noticed more signs of people. Broken branches, flattened grass, pieces of trash tucked into the bushes. It felt like someone had been here recently, and I wasn't the first person on this trail that day. After a while, the trail opened into another clearing. This one was larger, and I could see the remains of what looked like a fire pit surrounded by rocks. Near the pit was a small, empty backpack and an overturned water bottle. I walked slowly around the clearing, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Not the light steps of an animal, but heavy, deliberate steps. They were coming from the trees on the far side of the clearing. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned quickly, scanning the trees with my flashlight. I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard a voice, low and rough, but I couldn't understand what was said. It was too quiet, too fast. I didn't try to answer or make a noise. I just stood frozen, clutching my knife. The footsteps started again. It was early September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip. The idea came on a quiet Sunday morning when I felt suffocated by the noise and rush of the city. I had spent the last few months working too hard at my job, sitting behind a computer for hours, feeling my body stiffen and my mind grow foggy. I needed to clear my head. I wanted to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere with trees and fresh air, and just walk until I found some peace. I planned the trip in a simple way. I chose a trail that was said to be moderately difficult, about 10 miles long, looping through a dense forest in a state park about 2 hours from where I lived. The park was not very popular, so I thought I would have the trail mostly to myself. I packed my small backpack carefully. A liter of water, some granola bars, a basic first aid kit, my phone with a portable charger, a flashlight, a map of the trail, a compass, and a light jacket in case it got cold. I wore sturdy hiking boots that I had used before, and I dressed in comfortable clothes. I left early that morning, driving alone with no music, just the sound of the engine and the occasional birds outside. When I arrived at the parking lot, there were only a few cars, which made me feel better about the solitude I was going to have. I double-checked my gear, made sure my phone was fully charged, and set off onto the trail just after sunrise. The air was crisp and smelled like pine needles and damp earth. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the tall trees. The first part of the hike was peaceful and easy. The trail was well marked with wooden signs, and the ground was soft with a thick layer of fallen leaves and pine needles. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the quiet and the coolness of the forest. Occasionally, I spotted small animals. A squirrel darting up a tree, birds hopping between branches, a rabbit disappearing into the underbrush. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the ground, the wind rustling through the leaves, and the distant calls of birds. About 2 hours in, the trail started to get steeper and rockier. The trees grew thicker, and the sunlight filtered through the branches in a dim green light. I noticed the temperature dropped slightly, and the air smelled more earthy and moist. I stopped to take a sip of water and eat a granola bar. My legs felt tired but strong. I looked around and felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Being alone in the woods for so long made me feel vulnerable, but also free. As I climbed higher, the trail narrowed and became harder to follow. The wooden signs were less frequent, and some had fallen or were covered by moss. I pulled out my map and compass, checking my position carefully. According to the map, I was near a small ridge that overlooked a valley. I decided to keep going up, hoping for a good view. After about an hour of climbing, the trail disappeared completely. The path was blocked by a fallen tree, and beyond it, the ground looked uneven and covered in thick brush. I scanned the area, trying to find any sign of a trail, but all I saw were dense trees and bushes. My heart started to beat faster. I knew I had two options: try to find a way around the fallen tree or turn back. I didn't want to give up yet. I thought maybe the trail had shifted or I had taken a wrong turn earlier. I decided to push through the brush carefully, using my hands to move branches aside and watching my step. The ground was uneven, with roots and rocks hidden under leaves. I had to move slowly to avoid twisting an ankle or getting scratched. After about 20 minutes of this, I realized the brush was getting thicker and the trees were closing in more tightly. The sunlight barely reached the ground, making it harder to see. My arms and legs were already covered in small cuts and scrapes from the branches. I stopped and looked back, but the path I came from was hard to make out too. I started to feel a knot of worry growing inside me. I had no way to know for sure if I was still on the trail or if I had wandered off completely. My phone's GPS wasn't reliable here, and I had no signal to call for help. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. I remembered what I had learned about hiking safety. The first rule was not to panic. The second was to stay put if you get lost. But I also knew that staying still in the middle of a dense forest could be dangerous if no one knew where I was. I decided to try to get back to the last point I was sure of, the ridge near the valley. Turning around was harder than I thought. The dense trees and bushes blocked my way. I tried to mark the route by breaking some small branches and dropping a few leaves here and there. I moved slowly and carefully, watching my footing. After another 20 minutes, I saw a faint light coming through the trees. It looked like the sun shining on a small clearing. I hurried toward it, hoping it was the ridge I wanted to reach. When I got there, I realized it was a small open area on the side of a hill. The view was partly blocked by trees, but I could see the valley below. It was beautiful, but it also made me feel small and alone. I sat down on a rock and took out my water bottle. My hands were shaking a little. I checked the time on my phone. It was just after noon. I estimated I had been walking for about 4 hours. I decided I should rest for a few minutes before trying to find the trail again. I took off my jacket and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The sun was warm, but the breeze was cool and refreshing. I looked around and tried to listen for any sounds of other hikers or nearby roads. There was only silence. After resting, I tried to figure out where to go next. I unfolded my map carefully and matched the landmarks I could see. According to the map, the main trail should be on the other side of the ridge. I needed to cross it and find the path that would lead me back down to the parking lot. I stood up, put my backpack on, and started moving toward the other side of the ridge. The slope was steep, and the ground was loose with gravel and dead leaves. I had to move carefully to avoid slipping. As I climbed down the hill, I noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling in the bushes. Just silence. The feeling of silence made my skin crawl. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I stopped and looked around. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks dark and rough. The shadows were long and deep. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the light was fading quickly. I quickened my pace, wanting to get out of this strange place before it got dark. I followed the slope down until I reached a narrow path covered in leaves and pine needles. I recognized it from the map. The trail. Relief washed over me like a wave. I felt my heart slow down. I walked along the trail, my boots making soft crunching sounds. I kept my eyes on the path, but I also looked around carefully. The forest was still quiet, but I told myself it was just because it was late afternoon. About an hour later, the trail opened up to a small creek with clear running water. I stopped to drink some water and refill my bottle from the creek using a small filter I always carried. The water was cold and fresh, and I felt energized again. I continued walking, the sun now low behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the ground. I had about 2 miles left to get back to the parking lot. I felt tired but hopeful. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was soft at first, like a twig snapping underfoot. Then another. I stopped and turned quickly, but I saw nothing but trees and bushes. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to listen carefully. The sounds came again, slow and deliberate, footsteps following me. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. I kept walking, but the footsteps continued, matching my pace. My heart started to pound harder. I glanced behind me again but saw no movement. I decided not to look back anymore and kept moving as fast as I could without running. My boots hit the ground harder now, breaking sticks and crunching leaves. The footsteps were still there, keeping pace. I reached a bend in the trail where I could see the parking lot in the distance through the trees. Relief was close, but the footsteps kept coming. I dared to glance behind one last time. In the dim light, I caught a shadow moving fast between the trees. Too big and too fast to be a deer. Fear took over. I broke into a run, my legs burning, lungs gasping for air. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I didn't look back. I just ran toward the parking lot. When I reached the clearing where I had left my car, I didn't slow down. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the shadow was gone. I drove away quickly, not stopping until I reached the main road. I felt safe only then. I told myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large dog, curious or following me. I was lucky to get away. That night, I lay awake in my bed, thinking about the hike. The forest was beautiful but wild and unpredictable. The silence, the lost trail, the footsteps behind me. It all made me realize how fragile safety can be in the wilderness. I was grateful to be alive, and I knew I would be more careful next time. From then on, I had always enjoyed hiking alone. It gave me a sense of freedom, a chance to disconnect from the noise of everyday life, and to challenge myself in ways I couldn't in my usual routine. That spring, I was itching for a new trail, something off the beaten path, something remote and less traveled. I had been reading about a state park several hours from my home that few people visited. The trail was said to be difficult, a real test of endurance and navigation skills. The descriptions mentioned dense woods, rough terrain, and an abandoned old logging road somewhere along the route. That last detail intrigued me more than I expected. I planned my trip carefully. I packed enough food and water for a full day, extra layers in case the weather changed, a map, compass, and my GPS just in case. My phone had barely any signal in that area, so I didn't count on it much. I told a couple of close friends where I was going and when I planned to be back, though I didn't expect them to worry. Hiking alone was something I did often, and I always made sure to be prepared. The drive there was long but peaceful. I left just after dawn, driving through winding country roads, watching the trees slowly get taller and the houses more spread out. When I finally reached the small parking area for the trailhead, I was the only car there. That was exactly what I wanted. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs and the cool breeze brush against my face. I hoisted my pack and started down the trail. First, everything was calm. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding between tall pine trees and thick bushes. Birds sang overhead, and I saw squirrels darting between the trunks. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles and leaves, muffling my footsteps. I moved steadily, taking breaks now and then to drink water or check my map. About 2 hours into the hike, the trail started to change. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush thickened. The ground became rockier and steeper. I had to pay close attention to the trail markers, faded orange paint on trees or small cairns built from stacked stones. It was easy to lose the path here, and I made sure to double-check every few minutes. I passed a small creek, its water clear and cold, and took a moment to refill my bottle. The sound of the water was soothing, but the forest around me had grown quiet. No birds, no insects, just the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the time of day. Late morning had a different rhythm in the forest. As I continued, I found the old logging road mentioned in the guide. It was barely visible beneath layers of dirt, moss, and fallen branches, but the wide clearing through the trees made it unmistakable. I stepped onto it and followed the path for a while. The road was rough and uneven, with deep ruts and puddles from last night's rain. The trees on either side leaned inward, their branches twisting together above, creating a dark tunnel. That was when I started to feel uneasy. The light filtering through the canopy dimmed, and shadows moved with every gust of wind. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on my mind. I focused on the map and compass, noting the route and distance. After about an hour on the logging road, I realized something was off. I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while, and the GPS showed I was slightly off my intended path. I stopped and studied the map carefully, trying to find where I might have gone wrong. The road ahead twisted and disappeared into thicker forest, and the GPS signal flickered. I decided to backtrack to a spot where I had seen a marker before. I turned around and started walking back, but the unease grew stronger. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the silence heavier. I kept scanning the area, alert for any sign of other people or animals, but saw nothing. Suddenly, I noticed footprints in the dirt, fresh footprints, likely from a pair of boots. They were deeper than mine, and they didn't belong to any animal I recognized. My heart rate picked up. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe another hiker had passed this way recently, or maybe a forest ranger. I followed the footprints for a while, hoping they would lead to the main trail or a clearing. The footprints led deeper into the woods, away from the logging road and the path I had been following. I hesitated, unsure whether to keep following them or go back to the road. The forest around me grew denser, the light dimmer. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, but not mine. It was impossible to tell if something or someone was nearby. I slowed down, eyes darting between the trees. The air felt thicker, heavier, and colder, even though the sun was still out. I tried to think clearly. I reminded myself I was trained to stay calm in the wilderness. I had a whistle, a flashlight, and my emergency blanket. I pulled out my phone and tried to get a signal, but still nothing. I decided to head back toward the logging road, thinking that sticking to a known path was safer. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone or something moving through the bushes not far from me. My blood froze. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to listen. The rustling stopped. I waited a long moment. Then the sound started again, this time coming from the opposite direction. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to be quiet but was still moving. I didn't want to panic. I started walking slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I stayed on the edge of the clearing, trying to keep my back to the trees, so I wouldn't get surrounded. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to force myself to breathe deeply. The rustling followed me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. It wasn't a deer or a squirrel, that much was clear. It was bigger, heavier. I thought about shouting or blowing my whistle, but I feared whoever or whatever it was would respond. The sun was sinking lower now, and the forest grew darker by the minute. I knew I had to find shelter soon or risk being caught out in the woods at night. The thought of spending the night here alone terrified me. I looked around for a place to hide, maybe a thick bush or a fallen tree to sit behind. I found a cluster of large rocks and ducked behind them. I waited, heart hammering, as the rustling grew louder and closer. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was a man, tall and wearing dirty clothes. His face was partially hidden by a hood. He carried a heavy backpack and something long and thin strapped to it, maybe a rifle or a walking stick. I froze. The man looked around, his eyes sharp and wary. He didn't seem to notice me behind the rocks. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't see me. He moved slowly, scanning the trees, then started walking back the way he had come. When he was out of sight, I exhaled slowly. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing out here alone, but something about him didn't feel right. I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to follow him at a distance. Maybe he knew a way out. Maybe he was a hunter or another hiker who could help me find my way. I stayed low, moving quietly through the underbrush. The forest was darker now, and the shadows made everything look strange and unfamiliar. After about 30 minutes, I saw a small clearing with an old cabin. It was made of rough logs, with a rusted tin roof and boarded up windows. The man had stopped here and was trying the door. It was locked. He looked frustrated and started walking around the cabin. I crouched behind a nearby tree and watched. I debated whether to approach or keep hiding. My gut told me to stay away. The man was unpredictable, and I didn't want to risk an encounter. The man finally gave up and moved away from the cabin. I followed, careful to keep my distance. He headed toward a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. It looked less traveled and more overgrown. I didn't know where this trail led, but I had no other choice. I followed him, hoping it would lead to the main road or a ranger station. The trail was rough and steep, with branches scraping my face and roots threatening to trip me. I stumbled several times but kept going. After an hour of following the trail, the man suddenly stopped and turned around. I froze. He stared directly at me. For a moment, I thought he had seen me, but then he just shook his head and disappeared into the trees. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep following him blindly. I had to find my own way out. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself. According to the map, I needed to head east to reach the main road. I took a deep breath and started walking in that direction. The forest was dark now, and the sounds of animals echoed around me. I was tired, hungry, and scared, but I kept moving. I focused on the compass needle and the map, marking landmarks as I went. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees. My heart leapt. I hurried toward the road and emerged onto the paved shoulder just as a car passed by. I waved my arms frantically until the driver slowed and pulled over. I explained quickly where I had been and that I was lost. The driver was kind and called the park rangers, who arrived shortly afterward. They escorted me back to the parking lot. I woke up before dawn that morning with a strange feeling in my chest. Not quite fear, but more like a tight knot of tension I couldn't explain. The air in my small apartment felt heavier than usual, like the kind of heaviness you feel before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was clear. I had planned this hike for weeks, and despite the nagging feeling, I forced myself out of bed, determined to go through with it. The trail I chose wasn't famous or well-traveled. It was a stretch of forest and hills a few hours away from the city, a place that wasn't crowded, where I could be alone with my thoughts and nature. The drive out was quiet. The roads curved through rolling hills and patches of forest, trees still bare from early spring, but with buds hinting at the coming summer. I parked at a small gravel lot near the trailhead, where a faded sign marked the start of the path. No one else was around, and the silence felt almost absolute, like I was stepping into a different world. I double-checked my backpack. Water, snacks, first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, a whistle, and my phone. Signal was patchy here, so I wasn't counting on much help if something went wrong. I pulled my jacket tighter around me against the cool morning air and started down the trail. At first, the hike was peaceful. The path wound gently through thick trees, the ground soft with pine needles and leaves. Birdsong floated through the air, and sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. I breathed deeply, feeling some of the tension in my chest ease. The trail had a slight incline, and my footsteps made a quiet crunching sound on the dirt and gravel. I noticed fresh animal tracks here and there, maybe deer or rabbits, and the occasional scurry of squirrels darting up trees. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine resin. After about an hour, I reached a clearing on the side of a hill. From here, I could see the valley below, fields and patches of forest stretching out toward distant mountains. The sun was higher now, warming the air. I stopped for a drink and to eat a quick snack. While sitting on a rock, I pulled out my map to check my progress. The trail forked a little further ahead, one path leading to a ridge overlooking the valley, the other winding down toward a small creek. I planned to take the ridge first. It looked promising for views and was marked as a popular spot to rest. Back on the trail, the trees grew thinner as I climbed higher. The path became steeper and rockier, and my breathing got heavier with the effort. Sweat soaked my shirt even though the temperature was comfortable. The ridge was narrower here, with sharp drops on one side. I moved carefully, placing each foot deliberately on stable rocks or packed earth. The forest gave way to scattered shrubs and wildflowers, and I could see the valley stretching out even wider now, the sunlight painting everything in soft gold. I paused near the edge to take in the view. The silence was broken only by the occasional call of a hawk circling far overhead and the rustle of wind through the leaves. I felt a swell of calm, the tension in my chest almost gone. But as I stood there, I caught sight of something unusual below, near the creek I was supposed to visit next. A figure moved just beyond the treeline, something about it out of place. It was hard to tell exactly what I saw. The trees distorted the shape, but it looked like a person. Not just anyone, though. This figure stood very still, watching, or maybe waiting. A sudden shiver ran down my spine, not from cold. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. Maybe someone else was out here hiking too, or maybe a hunter. I scanned the area but didn't see any signs of a campsite or fire. The figure was gone when I looked again. I decided not to dwell on it and pressed on. The trail down to the creek was steeper, the ground damp and slippery from melting snow higher up. I took slow, careful steps, using a tree branch for balance where the path narrowed sharply. The creek was smaller than I expected, a thin stream cutting through mossy rocks and fallen logs. The water was clear and cold. I knelt to drink some, cupping my hands, the chill biting through my skin. Nearby, I noticed something else, footprints. Fresh footprints in the soft mud by the water's edge, too big to be an animal's. They were spaced too far apart to be a child's and looked like they were made by someone wearing heavy boots. The prints headed upstream, disappearing into thick brush. My heart quickened. Whoever made them was still close by. I debated whether to follow the tracks or head back the way I came. The logical part of my brain told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, pushed me to keep going. I pulled my jacket tighter and moved upstream along the creek, stepping carefully on rocks and roots. The forest grew thicker here, the canopy blocking much of the sunlight, making everything dim and cool. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the soft babble of the creek. After a while, The footprints disappeared completely, and the trail I was on became less clear, overgrown with ferns and low branches. I had to duck and push through brush, my arms scratched by thorns and twigs. That's when I realized I had lost the trail entirely. I stopped and looked around. The trees were dense and tall, the underbrush thick. I couldn't see any markers or signs of a path. The creek had narrowed into a trickle and disappeared underground somewhere ahead. My phone showed no signal at all. Panic started to bubble in my chest. I was deep in unfamiliar woods with no clear way out. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The forest was a maze of gray trunks and green leaves. No landmarks, no sounds except my breathing and the occasional bird call. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows between the trees. I knew I didn't have much time before it got dark. I found a small flat rock and sat down to think. I drank some water and ate the last of my snacks, trying to stay calm. I checked my compass and figured I needed to head back roughly the way I came, northeast, to reach the ridge and then the parking lot beyond. I stood up and started walking in that direction. The ground was uneven and covered in loose stones and fallen branches. Every step I took, my heart pounded louder in my ears. After about 20 minutes of walking, I heard something else, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was wind, but it was more like the snapping of twigs or dry branches breaking. The sound moved through the trees in irregular bursts, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. It wasn't constant, but it didn't stop. I froze. My mind raced. Was it a wild animal? A bear or a mountain lion? Or something else? I remembered my whistle and held it in my hand, ready to use it if necessary. I scanned the shadows between the trees but saw nothing. The sounds didn't seem natural, though. They had a certain rhythm, like someone walking quickly, stopping, then moving again. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now. My legs burned with fatigue, my breathing ragged. The forest seemed to close in around me. The light was fading fast. I wished I had brought a headlamp. My flashlight was packed deep in my bag, and I didn't want to stop and unpack it unless I absolutely had to. The snapping noises followed me, always just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was tracking me, maybe watching me from behind the trees. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but dark trunks and leaves. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that maybe there was a hunter or another hiker far behind me, but the unease didn't go away. I reached a slight rise and looked out ahead. The forest thinned a little, and I could see the faint outline of the ridge where I had been earlier. Relief washed over me. I was close to safety. I moved downhill carefully but quickly. The snapping sounds stopped suddenly. Silence fell again. Then, as I stepped onto a patch of flat ground, I saw it. A makeshift campsite hidden behind a clump of trees, with a small fire pit surrounded by stones. It looked abandoned. The fire pit had ashes and some half-burnt logs. Nearby, I spotted some empty cans and plastic wrappers scattered on the ground. The site was clearly used recently. I checked my watch. It was almost dusk. I decided not to linger. I kept walking toward the ridge, hoping to find the trail I had followed earlier. Suddenly, I heard voices. Not loud, but close, low murmurs and movement. I stopped and listened. The voices weren't shouting or laughing. They were quiet, tense, almost angry. My heart slammed in my chest. I crouched behind a tree and peered carefully toward the sound. Through the branches, I saw two men. They looked rough, dressed in heavy boots and jackets, their faces shadowed by caps. They didn't notice me. They were arguing quietly, pacing near the fire pit. Something about their posture and tone made me want to get away as fast as possible. I had no idea who they were or what they were doing out here, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and hurried in the opposite direction, trying not to make noise. My foot caught on a root and I stumbled, catching myself on a tree. The men stopped talking and looked toward the noise. I froze. After a moment, they went back to their argument, but I didn't wait to see more. It started as a normal solo hiking trip. I'd been planning to explore a less popular trail in northern Utah for months. I'd picked a route through an area I'd never hiked before, deep in the Uinta Mountains, about 3 hours from my place. It wasn't completely isolated, but not many people used this trail either, which is what I liked. I wanted peace, solitude, and something that felt like real wilderness. I left home early on a Thursday morning. I packed my backpack with a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, dehydrated meals, a water filter, and a few basic supplies. I had a topo map printed out and downloaded offline maps on my phone, even though I knew reception would disappear once I drove further into the mountains. I always carried a backup battery and a small solar panel too. I was used to hiking alone, and I'd never had anything more than blisters or a sore ankle go wrong. The drive took longer than I expected. The last hour was on a dirt Forest Service road with deep ruts and patches of loose rock. I had to drive slowly, but I eventually made it to the small, dirt parking area at the base of the trail. There was one other car parked there, dusty and old, maybe a Subaru. It looked like it hadn't moved in a couple of days. I didn't think much of it. It's normal for other hikers to park and camp out for a few days. I locked up, slung on my pack, and started hiking around 10:30 in the morning. The trail climbed steadily for a few miles through thick pines. The forest was quiet. No wind, just the sound of my boots crunching the gravel, the occasional bird call, and once or twice, the distant scurry of something in the underbrush. After a couple of hours, the trees thinned out and I came to a meadow that sloped gently uphill towards some rocky ridges. There was a small creek running along the edge of it, and I filled up my bottles there before continuing. I stopped for lunch around 1 p.m. on a flat overlook with a view of the valley behind me. I had a peanut butter sandwich and a protein bar, then checked the map. My goal was to make it to a small alpine lake marked about 8 miles from the trailhead. I figured I'd reach it by late afternoon and set up camp there. From what I'd read, the lake wasn't often visited. There was no official name, just a small body of water nestled in a bowl surrounded by cliffs. It sounded perfect. By 3 p.m., the clouds started rolling in. Dark ones, low and heavy. I picked up my pace. I didn't want to get caught in a storm above tree line. I was still about a mile from the lake when the rain started. Not heavy at first, just a few drops, but I knew what was coming. I pushed harder, heart pounding, legs sore, but I finally saw the outline of the lake through the trees. I was almost there. I made it just as the rain started falling harder. I found a small clearing tucked under some trees on the north side of the lake and set up my tent quickly. My clothes were damp but not soaked. Once inside, I peeled off my outer layers and changed into dry ones. I made a quick dinner of rice and beans on my little stove while the rain drummed on the nylon above me. By nightfall, the storm passed. The sky cleared a little, and I stepped outside to use the bathroom and check out the lake. It was beautiful, calm and still, with mist drifting above the surface. The cliffs around it looked almost black in the low light. I didn't hear any animals. No frogs, no birds, no insects buzzing. Just silence. I didn't think much of it. I'd had quiet nights in the backcountry before. I slept pretty well that first night. I woke up once around 3 a.m. needing to pee, and when I unzipped the tent, the air outside was cold and damp. I stepped out barefoot and handled my business a few feet from the tent, then stood there for a minute, looking at the stars. It was incredibly clear, not a cloud left in the sky. I crawled back into the tent and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I made oatmeal and coffee and packed a small day pack to explore the area around the lake. I followed a faint game trail up one side of the cliffs for a better view. The lake looked smaller from up high. There were no signs of campsites or fires anywhere around it. No footprints either, not even mine from the day before. The ground was hard and rocky. That wasn't too weird, but it gave me an eerie feeling, like I was the only one who had been there in a long time. That afternoon, I hiked another mile or so past the lake, just to see what was beyond. I found another small meadow, but it was marshy and full of mosquitoes. I didn't linger. I made it back to camp before dark and boiled water for another simple meal. The second night was colder. I bundled up and listened to the wind move through the trees until I fell asleep. At around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. There was no sound, not even wind. It was like the entire forest had gone still. I lay there in my sleeping bag, completely awake, heart starting to pound. I didn't hear footsteps, or voices, or anything clear, just that strange silence, a pressure in the air. I sat up and unzipped the tent slowly. I poked my head out and looked around. Nothing, just darkness and trees and the lake beyond them. I stepped out again, just to make sure everything was normal. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I saw something across the lake. A light. It wasn't bright. It looked like a small flashlight beam, just moving slowly between the trees. I froze. The light didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another person the whole time I'd been out here. There was no one else camped nearby. It moved in a slow zigzag, like someone walking without purpose, just scanning the trees. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I crouched behind the side of my tent and watched. The light stayed in one place for a long time. Then it shut off. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I slowly backed into the tent and zipped it up. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there in my bag, knife in one hand, listening. There was nothing. No crunching footsteps. No voices. No sounds at all. By morning, I was exhausted. I made coffee and packed up camp fast. I didn't eat breakfast. I just wanted to get moving. I scanned the far side of the lake as I hiked out. There was nothing there. No one. No tracks. I reached the top of the ridge and looked back one last time. Still nothing. About halfway back to the trailhead, I stopped to rest. That's when I noticed the footprint. Just one. Off to the side of the trail, half in mud. It wasn't mine. It was wider, maybe from a different boot. The tread pattern didn't match my own. It was fresh. I got moving again, faster this time. I didn't stop again. I pushed through the last few miles without resting. I was sweating, even though the air was cool. I didn't feel safe until I saw my car. The other car, the old Subaru, was still there. Still dusty. I checked it out more closely this time. The plates were from another state. I looked through the windows. There was a backpack in the back seat and a map on the dash, but no sign of anyone. I didn't like the feeling I got. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started it. As I pulled out, I glanced back at the trailhead. No one was there, just trees and silence. I drove straight home. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That light, the footprint, the parked car. Something was wrong. I finally called the local ranger station and gave them a report. I didn't tell them everything, just that I saw a car parked there for several days and didn't see anyone near it. They said they'd check it out. A few days later, they called me back. The car belonged to a man who had gone missing over 2 weeks earlier. His family had filed a report, but no one had found him. They sent out a search team. I never heard anything after that. I checked the news, but nothing came up. It was like he just disappeared. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. I still love the mountains. I still think about the peace of that lake, but something about that place felt wrong. Not in a ghost story way, just off. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, like someone else was. And I still think about that light, the way it moved, the way it stopped. Someone was out there, and I wasn't supposed to see them. I never thought a simple hike could turn into something that would shake me to my core. Looking back, it's strange to think how something that started as a normal day in the woods turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. No ghosts, no monsters, just a situation that felt very real, very dangerous, and very isolating. It was early autumn, and the leaves were just starting to change color. The air had that crispness that hinted at winter around the corner, but was still warm enough during the day to be comfortable. I decided to take a solo hike on a trail I had never tried before. It was supposed to be a moderate trail, about 8 miles long, looping through a heavily wooded area in a national forest about 2 hours from where I lived. I had done plenty of hikes on my own before, nothing ever like this one. I packed my usual gear, a small backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and my phone, though I wasn't counting on getting a signal out there. I had a compass too, just in case. I always made sure I had the essentials because I knew how quickly things could go wrong. My plan was to start early, hike the loop, and be back before dark. The morning was calm. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. A few cars were parked, but no one was around. I liked the peace. I set off on the path, the ground soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. The forest was dense. The trees stood tall and thick, their branches forming a natural roof overhead that filtered the sunlight into a golden glow. The smell of damp earth, pine, and decaying leaves was strong but not unpleasant. The first few miles passed easily. The trail wound up and down through hills and small valleys. I noticed the occasional animal track in the mud, deer, squirrel, maybe even a fox. Birds chirped high in the branches. The sound was soothing, and I felt a kind of calm settle over me. It was just me and the woods. I kept a steady pace, taking breaks only to drink water and eat some trail mix. The map was clear, and the trail was well marked with small painted blazes on trees. I wasn't worried. The path was narrow but obvious. It felt good to be alone with my thoughts and the natural world. As I neared the halfway point, I came to a small clearing. It opened up to a tiny meadow surrounded by tall pines. The grass was thick and green, and a small stream ran through one side, the water sparkling in the sun. I sat down on a fallen log to rest and eat an energy bar. The quiet was almost complete here. No cars, no planes overhead, just the natural sounds of water trickling and leaves rustling. After about 20 minutes, I got up and started walking again. This next stretch was supposed to be a gentle downhill toward the trail's end. The trees were spaced a bit farther apart here, and the ground felt drier. I was starting to feel tired but still good. The sun was moving lower in the sky, casting longer shadows. That's when things started to get strange. About a mile into the downhill section, I noticed something odd. The trail suddenly became less clear. The painted blazes were missing for a while. At first, I thought maybe I had missed a turn or the markings had faded. I stopped and pulled out the map and compass to check my location. I was still on the right track according to the compass, but something didn't feel right. I looked around. The forest was quieter here. The birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the occasional rustle of dry leaves in the breeze. I scanned the trees for any sign of the blazes but couldn't find any. I started walking more carefully, watching the ground for the worn path. Then I saw it. Off to my right, about 20 feet from the trail, there was a narrow dirt path. It wasn't on my map. The ground looked recently disturbed, with footprints and broken branches. I hesitated. I didn't recognize this path. It looked like something people might use to shortcut or maybe a game trail animals used. I checked my compass again and saw that following this new path would take me in a slightly different direction than the official trail. But I also noticed the official trail seemed to disappear into a thick patch of underbrush. The blazes were definitely gone. The sun was lower now, maybe mid-afternoon, and I knew I had to decide quickly. I considered turning back, but the thought of retracing miles I had already covered didn't feel right. I figured maybe the trail had shifted or been damaged by weather, and this new path might reconnect. So, I decided to follow the dirt path cautiously. At first, it was easy to walk. The path was narrow but clear enough. The trees closed in tighter, and the canopy thickened, blocking more sunlight. I felt a chill even though the day was still warm. I told myself it was just the shade. After about 10 minutes, the path became less distinct. The dirt gave way to thick leaves and twigs, and the sides of the path were lined with thorny bushes. I had to push branches aside to keep going. The trail became steeper, climbing up a small hill. As I moved higher, the forest grew denser. The underbrush was thick and tangled. I had to be careful not to trip or get scratched. My legs were starting to ache, but I kept going. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a sharp cracking sound like a broken twig. I froze and turned slowly, scanning the trees. There was nothing there. No animals, no people, just empty woods. I shrugged it off, probably a squirrel or bird. But the feeling of being watched crept over me. I picked up my pace. The path curved sharply to the left and then disappeared completely into a tangle of bushes and fallen trees. I stopped, couldn't go forward. I turned around, but the way back was blocked by thick branches and thorny bushes. Somehow, the path I had taken was gone, or at least hidden. Panic started to set in. I pulled out my phone, but as expected, no signal. I tried the flashlight even though there was still daylight. I was starting to feel vulnerable out here, alone and lost. I sat down on a large rock to catch my breath and think. The reality hit me. I was off the marked trail, in dense woods I didn't know, with no way to call for help. The sun was dropping fast. I had no idea which way to go. I studied my map and compass again. The compass pointed roughly south. I figured if I kept walking south, I might eventually find the official trail or a road. I got up and started moving carefully. The ground was uneven, with roots and rocks. I stepped quietly, listening for any signs of other hikers or wildlife. After about 30 minutes of walking, I saw a break in the trees ahead. I walked toward it, hoping it was the trail. It was a small dirt road, barely wide enough for a car. The sun was low now, casting an orange glow. Relief flooded me. I checked my watch, still enough time to follow this road back to the trailhead. I began walking down the road quickly. The road was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on gravel. The trees on either side were tall and shadowed. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched returned stronger. About 20 minutes down the road, I noticed tire tracks. Fresh. Someone had been here recently. That was a good sign. But then I noticed something else. Some pieces of torn fabric caught on a branch. They looked like the kind of clothes hikers wore. A shiver ran down my spine. I picked up the pace. I wanted to believe this was nothing, just some leftover trash or an abandoned campsite. But the torn fabric, the footprints earlier on the dirt path, the feeling of being watched, everything made my skin crawl. As I walked, the light grew dimmer. The road curved sharply, and I saw something ahead. A small cabin, old and weathered, tucked between trees. It looked abandoned. The windows were dark, some broken. The door hung slightly open. I debated whether to approach. Maybe it was a ranger station or a place to wait for help. Or maybe not. I stayed on the road and kept going. After another 15 minutes, I finally saw the trailhead. The parking lot was empty now, and my car was there, just like I left it. I unlocked the door and sat down inside, heart pounding. I locked the doors and took a deep breath. I realized how lucky I was to have found the road and made it back safely. I thought about how easily things could have gone wrong. If I had taken the wrong turn a little later, or if I had kept following that dirt path blindly, I might still be lost. I felt shaken but relieved. The forest was beautiful but also unpredictable. That day taught me to respect the woods more and never take the trail for granted. I went home that evening tired, sore, but thankful. I changed my hiking plans after that. I never went on a solo hike without telling someone exactly where I was going, and I made sure to have more gear, including an emergency beacon. The memory of those quiet, shadowed woods and the strange dirt path stayed with me for years. No ghosts, no fairy tale monsters, just real fear born from getting lost and feeling isolated in the wilderness. That was enough to scare me forever. It started like any other weekend. I had been planning this hike for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the endless hum of traffic, the constant pressure at work. Sometimes, the only way I could find peace was to disappear into the woods for a day or two. I didn't want a difficult trail. Nothing too long, nothing too steep, just enough to feel like I was really out there, far away from everything. I chose a trail I had never been to before but had heard about. It was in a state park about 2 hours from my house. The place was supposed to be quiet, not very popular, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my backpack with the usual water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. I wore my hiking boots, a comfortable jacket, and carried a sturdy walking stick I had picked up at an outdoor store. I arrived early in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, and the sky was painted in soft pinks and light blues. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. I parked my car in a small dirt lot, grabbed my backpack, and started on the trail. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign, old and a bit faded, but it clearly said the name of the trail and a small map showing the loop I planned to hike. The first part of the trail was easy, a gentle slope covered in soft dirt and scattered pine needles. I walked slowly, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching on the ground, the occasional birds singing in the trees above. The forest was dense here, tall pine and oak trees stretching high, their branches thick and full of leaves. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in patches, creating a pattern of light and shadow on the trail. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth rocks and fallen branches. I stopped to rest, took off my backpack, and drank some water. The quiet was almost complete except for the gentle rush of the creek and the distant sound of a woodpecker tapping on a tree. From there, the trail became less maintained. The path was narrower and uneven, roots crossing it like tangled snakes, rocks jutting up from the soil. I had to watch my steps carefully. I noticed fewer people had been here recently. The trail markers were old and some had fallen or were covered with moss. I pulled out my map and compass to make sure I was still on the right route. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew closer, the branches intertwining to form a thick roof overhead. The sunlight dimmed, and the air turned cooler and damper. The smell changed too. There was more moss, wet leaves, and the faint, sharp scent of decaying wood. At one point, the trail split into two. The map showed I should take the left path, which was supposed to loop back to the parking lot in about 2 miles. The right path led deeper into the forest and was marked as unmaintained and not recommended. I stuck to the left. I started feeling uneasy, but I told myself it was just because I was alone and in unfamiliar territory. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about the silence felt too complete. No birds, no wind, just the soft sound of my footsteps. Even the creek's noise was gone now. I paused and listened carefully. It was so still it almost felt unnatural. I kept walking but slowed down. The trail became harder to follow. There were fewer signs and markers, and some of the blazes painted on the trees were faint or missing. My heart started to beat faster. I pulled out my compass again and checked it. The direction seemed right, but I had a nagging feeling I was walking in circles. Then, the worst happened. I came to a place where the trail disappeared entirely. The ground was uneven, covered in thick underbrush and fallen branches. There was no clear path forward. I scanned the area for any sign of the trail, but it looked like nature was reclaiming the forest here. I tried to backtrack, but it was hard to tell exactly where I had come from. The trees all looked the same. The ground was covered with dry leaves and twigs, and my footsteps from earlier were already fading. I didn't have cell service, so I couldn't call for help or check GPS. I realized I was lost. Panic started to rise inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew getting scared would only make things worse. I took a deep breath and sat down on a fallen log. I pulled out my water bottle and took a sip. Then I looked at my map again, trying to figure out where I was. The map wasn't very detailed in this part of the forest. It showed some trails, a small river, and a clearing, but nothing specific that matched where I was standing. I realized I hadn't thought to mark my progress or leave any markers as I walked. That was a mistake I would regret. I decided to try to find the creek again. Water would be a good landmark. If I followed it downstream, maybe it would lead me back to the parking lot or a ranger station. I took out my walking stick and pushed aside some branches to find a direction. As I moved through the forest, the underbrush became thicker, the trees more crowded. Every step was harder. I had to duck under low branches and step over fallen logs. My legs ached. My backpack felt heavier. The daylight was fading faster than I expected. After walking for what felt like an hour but might have been less, I heard a faint sound, a soft rushing noise. My heart lifted. It was the creek. I hurried toward the sound, pushing through the bushes until I reached the water. The creek was narrow and shallow, but I recognized it from earlier. Relief washed over me. I decided to follow the creek downstream. The ground near the water was wet and muddy, and the path was still rough, but at least I had a direction. I stayed close to the water, careful not to slip. The forest grew darker as the sun sank behind the trees. The temperature dropped, and I could feel a chill creeping into my bones. I stopped to pull on my jacket's hood and check my flashlight. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it yet. I kept walking, But after a while, the creek started to bend sharply, and the bank on the side I was walking became steep and slippery. I looked for a way to cross, but there was no bridge or shallow spot. The water was flowing faster here, and the bank was covered with wet rocks. I debated what to do. Turning back would mean losing time and energy, but trying to climb the steep bank and cross the creek in the dark seemed dangerous. I finally decided to climb up the bank and find a safer place to cross upstream. It was slow and exhausting. My hands and boots slipped on moss-covered rocks, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. When I finally reached the top, I found myself on a narrow ridge with a steep drop on one side down to the creek and thick trees on the other. The ridge was so narrow I had to walk carefully. One wrong step could mean falling down the slope. My heart pounded harder with every step. The light was almost gone now, and the forest was turning into shadows and shapes I could barely make out. I stopped and turned around, trying to see the way back. The only light came from the faint glow of my flashlight, which I tried to conserve. I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to find my way out before nightfall fully set in. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was faint, a crunching sound like someone or something stepping on dry leaves. I froze. The noise didn't come from the creek or the wind. It was close, maybe a few yards away, on the other side of the ridge. I held my breath, my ears straining. The noise stopped. I waited for several minutes, but there was no other sound. My mind raced. Was it another hiker? An animal? A deer, maybe? But it didn't sound like a deer. I tried to tell myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination. I told myself to focus, keep moving, and find the way out. I turned back toward the creek and continued following it. The ridge ended, and I was able to climb down to the water again. The creek's noise was louder now, more constant, and it comforted me. After walking some more, I came across a fallen tree that formed a natural bridge over the creek. I crossed it carefully, balancing on the slippery bark. On the other side, the forest opened up a little. I saw some faint tire tracks in the mud. I felt a spark of hope. Maybe a logging road or a service path was nearby. I followed the tire tracks, moving faster now. The ground was softer, and the trees were spaced farther apart. Soon, I saw a small dirt road ahead, wide enough for a truck. I ran toward it, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The road was empty and looked rarely used, but it was better than the dense forest. I started walking along the road, hoping to find a way to the main park entrance or a road that led back to my car. After about 30 minutes, I heard the faint sound of an engine. I stopped and listened carefully. It was a truck. Someone was nearby. I waved my flashlight and stepped onto the road, trying to make myself visible. The truck slowed down and stopped a few yards away. A man stepped out. He looked surprised to see me but didn't say anything at first. I pointed toward the direction I came from, then to the road. He nodded and motioned for me to get in. I climbed into the truck gratefully. The warmth inside was a welcome change from the cold forest. The man drove slowly down the road. After a few minutes, we reached a small ranger station. I went hiking alone last summer. It was early July, hot and dry, and I had taken time off from work just to clear my head. I was dealing with a lot at the time: stress, bad sleep, constant deadlines. I wanted something that would take me away from screens and noise and people. I found a loop trail deep in northern Wyoming, not far from the Bighorn Mountains. It wasn't super popular, but it wasn't totally off the grid either. About 20 miles total, marked well, with decent elevation changes and enough scenery to keep it interesting. I planned to take 2 days and 1 night. I parked my truck in the small lot by the ranger station, left a note on the dash saying my route, packed light but carefully, tent, stove, water filter, some dehydrated meals, bear spray, extra socks. I double-checked the weather and made sure my GPS and backup paper map matched up. I also brought my old analog compass, more for peace of mind than anything else. I hit the trail mid-morning. The first few miles were pretty easy, tall pines lining the path, with some shaded areas where the wind would funnel through and cool things down. I passed a couple other hikers, both solo, one heading out and one coming in. Both gave a quick wave. After that, I didn't see anyone. By the 5th mile, I could already feel how isolated it was. I liked that at first. There was a kind of peacefulness in the dry crunch of my boots on the trail, the smell of pine sap, the rhythmic sound of birds and insects. I followed the main trail until it forked, then took the branch that led higher up. It was steeper and slower going, but I wanted the views. Around mile 8, I started noticing signs of erosion. The trail got narrow in spots, and some parts looked like they'd been washed out by spring runoff. I had to edge around loose gravel areas and use my poles more than I thought I would. Still manageable, though. I wasn't worried yet. Late in the afternoon, I found a flat spot to set up camp. It was near a bend in the trail where it overlooked a small valley, with the mountains silhouetted in the background. I pitched my tent, boiled some water, and ate a lukewarm pouch of beef stew. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't realize how much I relied on little background sounds until I noticed the total lack of them. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up around midnight and made the tent flap hard. It wasn't stormy, just dry gusts pushing through the trees. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something outside. Not animals, but movement. Maybe trees creaking or dirt shifting. I told myself it was nothing. By morning, I felt tired but determined to finish the loop. I packed up and started hiking again. The trail sloped downward for a while and curved around the ridge. I stopped now and then to check my map and make sure I was still on course. My GPS showed the right track. Around mile 13, I noticed something odd. There were footprints, fresh ones, going in the same direction I was. They looked like hiking boots, but heavier, wider. At first, I figured it was someone else who started early, maybe before I woke up. But the strange thing was that I hadn't passed any other campsites, and the prints didn't follow a normal stride. Some were deep, like the person had suddenly stopped or jumped. By mile 15, the trail got narrow again. There were downed trees across the path and more signs of erosion. I had to climb over a few logs and nearly slipped on a slope where the dirt had given out. My legs were getting sore, and my shoulders ached from the pack. I stopped for a break and took off my shoes to let my feet cool down. That's when I noticed the forest felt different. Heavier, like the air had thickened. There was no breeze, no bird calls. Just the sound of my own breathing and a few distant tree limbs shifting. It made me uneasy, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to laugh it off, stood up, and pushed on. About a mile later, I saw something that stopped me cold. A pile of stones off to the side of the trail, stacked in a way that looked intentional. Not like someone marking a trail, but more like a crude monument. About knee-high, there were scratches on a tree nearby. Not claw marks, more like deep scrapes from a blade. Long, jagged lines. I looked around, scanned the trees, and felt that buzz of alertness crawl up my back. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I started moving faster. I didn't want to camp again. I wanted out. I had about 4 miles left. The trail dipped into a narrow ravine at mile 17. It was damp and shady with steep sides and thick brush. My GPS glitched there. I tried restarting it, but it kept flickering. My compass still worked, so I followed the paper map and guessed the route based on landmarks. But something felt off. The ravine was longer than it should have been. I checked the time. I'd been walking nearly an hour and had barely covered a mile. That's when I heard it. Twigs snapping, maybe 30 yards behind me. I froze. No wind, no animals, just the steady sound of someone, or something, following my steps. I turned around, saw nothing, waited. Nothing moved. I shouted, but it came out shaky and low. No answer. I moved fast after that. Not quite running, but not taking breaks either. My legs burned. My throat was dry. I didn't stop to drink, didn't stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of the ravine. By the time I reached the last stretch of trail, I was disoriented. The path split again in a way that wasn't on the map. My GPS was still dead, stuck on the same screen. I picked the direction that felt right, but the trail narrowed to almost nothing, just a game path. I kept going until it ended at a small clearing I didn't recognize. I dropped my pack and checked everything again. Map, compass, landmarks. Nothing made sense. The terrain didn't match. I felt panic rising, but I forced myself to breathe. I backtracked, tried the other trail branch. It looped back to the same clearing. I was lost. The sun was starting to drop, and I knew I didn't have a second night's worth of food. I had water, but I was running low. I found a stream not far off the path and filtered a few liters. I didn't feel like eating. I just sat on a rock and waited for the light to fade. That night, I didn't pitch the tent. I sat against a tree with my knife in my hand. Every sound made me jump. I could hear rustling in the brush. Once I saw a shape move through the trees. Tall, slow, too far to make out. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I started walking. No map, no trail, just compass bearings and instinct. I followed the stream for miles, hoping it would lead to a road or a bigger river. I slipped twice, cut my palm on a rock. My legs were covered in scrapes from the brush. Midday, I found a broken fence. Old wood, rotted and sagging, but it meant something. Human-made. I followed it uphill and found a logging road. Dirt and gravel with old tire tracks. I walked that road until I reached a gate. Beyond it, a cabin. Looked abandoned but solid. I knocked anyway. No answer. I didn't go in. I followed the road farther, and after another mile, it intersected a paved road. I saw a truck go by and waved it down. The driver was a Forest Service worker. I told him I got turned around hiking. He drove me back to the ranger station. My truck was still there, a fine layer of dust on the windshield. I'd been out 3 days. I didn't realize I'd lost that much time. Nothing happened after that. I didn't report anything. Didn't mention the monument, the prints, or the shape in the woods. I didn't want to deal with it. I just went home, unpacked, took a long shower, and slept for nearly a full day. I haven't hiked alone since. I still love the woods, but I stay on marked trails now. Busy ones. Places where I can hear people's voices echoing off the trees. Where the quiet doesn't feel like a trap. Whatever happened out there was real, but it wasn't magic or ghosts. It was something else. Person maybe, or just the forest itself. Unpredictable, old, and full of corners we still don't understand. All I know is that I made it out, and that's enough. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the northern part of Wyoming in late September. I'd been working long hours at my job in Billings, Montana, and I was starting to feel the stress wearing me down. I wanted something quiet, far from phone signals, cars, and people. Something real, just me and nature. I chose an area near the Bighorn Mountains, not too well known, but not completely off-grid either. There were a few scattered trails, and I had planned a 2-day hike that would take me deep into a canyon with a stream running through it, then up through a long, forested ridge, and finally loop back to the dirt road where I parked my truck. I started my hike early in the morning. The air was crisp, and there was still dew on the grass. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I followed a marked trail along the edge of the woods, crossed a few clearings, and eventually reached the start of the canyon. The walls of the canyon weren't too steep at first, but as I went deeper, the rock faces got higher, and the sun disappeared behind them. The trail followed the stream. The sound of the water running over rocks was calming. I stopped around noon to eat. I had packed some trail mix, jerky, and a few energy bars. I sat on a rock by the water, took my boots off to let my feet breathe, and just enjoyed the quiet. I didn't see anyone else the whole day. No fresh boot prints, no rappers, no signs of campers or hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. After lunch, I kept walking. The trail started to fade out after a while, but I had a GPS and a printed map, and I'd done my research, so I wasn't worried. The stream narrowed, and the canyon walls got tighter. At one point, I had to climb over some fallen boulders where there had been a rock slide. It slowed me down, but it wasn't dangerous, just tiring. After a couple more hours, I got to the end of the canyon and started climbing up the ridge. The trail was barely visible now. It was mostly just worn patches of dirt between the trees and the bushes. I had to stop often to check the GPS and make sure I was on track. The climb was steep in some areas, and the trees got denser. By the time the sun started dipping behind the ridge, I found a small flat area just off the trail to set up camp. I pitched my one-man tent, filtered some water from a small trickle nearby, and made a simple meal with my camp stove. As the sky darkened, the cold came quickly. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and lay there listening to the forest. I heard nothing unusual, just some rustling leaves, maybe a distant owl. It was quiet enough that I fell asleep faster than I expected. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the freezing air. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, and everything was still. I took care of what I needed to and crawled back into the tent. Just as I started to drift off again, I heard a sharp crack. Not a branch falling or something small, but something heavy stepping on a branch. My body tensed. I held my breath. Another step, then nothing. I stayed still for a long time. Could have been a deer, maybe even a bear, but it didn't sound like an animal moving through the woods. It was just those 2 steps. I stayed awake for what felt like an hour, listening. Eventually, I must have dozed off again. When I woke up the next morning, there were no tracks around the tent. The ground was hard-packed in that area, though, so that didn't mean much. I made a mental note to be cautious and packed up camp. The second day's hike was supposed to be easier. The trail followed the ridge for a while, then gradually sloped down through a forest and opened into a wide valley before curving back to where I'd started. I ate a quick breakfast and started walking, but something felt different that day. Not in the forest, but in me. I felt on edge. My body was jumpy. Every sound in the trees made me turn my head. Couple of hours in, I took a wrong turn. I knew it almost immediately because the ridge I was on sloped in the wrong direction. I pulled out my GPS and saw I was a bit off track, so I decided to bushwhack west to rejoin the trail. It didn't look too far, but what I didn't realize was how thick the underbrush had gotten in that area. Every step was a fight through tangled branches, uneven ground, and slippery moss-covered rocks. It slowed me down a lot. Eventually, I found what looked like an old trail or game path. It wasn't on my map, but it was heading in the right direction, so I followed it. That path led me down a gentle slope and into a darker, more densely wooded area. The trees were tall and blocked out a lot of the light, even though it was still mid-morning. I kept walking, checking the GPS every so often. I thought I'd rejoin the main trail soon, but then the path stopped, just vanished. I looked around, confused. There wasn't any clear direction to go. The GPS was glitching too. It showed my location jumping around, like I was teleporting a few feet in different directions. That had never happened before. I turned it off and back on. It was still acting weird. I tried to retrace my steps, but after just a few minutes, everything looked unfamiliar. I started to realize I was lost. I kept moving slowly, trying to head uphill to get a better view, but the trees were too dense. The terrain was uneven, and I was burning a lot of energy. I hadn't eaten much that day, and I started to feel lightheaded. At around noon, I stopped to rest. I rationed out another energy bar and some water. I tried to stay calm. I knew panicking would make it worse. I figured I'd keep heading west and eventually I'd hit either the main trail or the road. The area wasn't massive. I just had to stay focused. I hiked for another couple of hours, but the forest didn't thin out. At one point, I started seeing old tree stumps, like there had been logging in the area long ago. There were rusty old barrels, broken boards, and even the shell of a metal trailer that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. That's when I got the feeling again, that strange heaviness, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I kept going. The sun was starting to dip again. My legs were tired, and I was starting to get careless, tripping over roots, bumping into branches. Then I slipped on a slope and went down hard. I landed on my left side and felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I lay there for a minute, breathing heavily, hoping it was just a twist. I tried to stand. My ankle screamed in pain. I had to sit back down. It wasn't broken, but I couldn't put my full weight on it. That's when the real fear kicked in. I was alone, injured, and lost in a place I didn't understand. I took some ibuprofen from my pack, wrapped my ankle as best I could with a spare shirt, and used a hiking pole to help support myself. I couldn't go fast anymore, but I had to keep moving. I needed to find flat ground before nightfall so I could set up the tent again. Just before dark, I found a small clearing that was slightly raised, with some dry leaves and open space between the trees. I set up the tent again, filtered a bit of water, and lay in my sleeping bag, shivering. I hadn't eaten dinner. I just didn't have the energy. That night was different. I heard footsteps again, this time more than two. Soft, slow, deliberate steps. They moved around the tent in a circle. My body froze. I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep much that night. When morning came, the pain in my ankle was worse. I could barely stand. I had no cell signal, the GPS was useless, and I had maybe 2 more energy bars left. I had to make a decision. Stay put and wait or keep moving. I chose to keep moving slowly. I used both hiking poles, dragging my bad leg behind. Every step was exhausting. Around midday, I saw something that made my heart jump. A trail marker. A real one. A small, weathered wooden post with a faded orange ribbon tied to it. I followed it. Then I saw another one, and another, and then a path. A real, maintained path. Relief flooded over me. I didn't know which trail it was yet, but it was a way out. I followed it, limping but motivated. By late afternoon, I came to a signpost. It had a name I recognized from my map, the southern loop of the trail I had originally planned to take. I was still a few miles from the truck, but I knew where I was. I pushed myself through the pain. Just before sunset, I saw the dirt road, then my truck. I almost cried. I sat in the driver's seat, turned the key, and just sat there shaking. My ankle throbbed, my body was sore, but I was safe. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Not because I was embarrassed, but because it's hard to explain what it felt like out there. How fast things can go wrong, how small and fragile you can feel. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just bad luck, bad terrain, and the terrifying weight of being completely alone. And those footsteps, I still don't know what they were, but I never went back to that part of the forest again. I went on a solo hiking trip in northern Montana back in late September. I had been planning it for months. I'm not a professional hiker or anything, but I'd done a good amount of solo hikes in the Midwest and a couple in the Smokies. I wanted something a little more remote this time, something that would push me a bit further but still be manageable without mountaineering gear. I found this trail system online, nothing official, more like a network of logging roads and old Forest Service paths that cut through a wide stretch of wilderness. It wasn't a popular area, which was the whole point. I wanted peace, quiet, nature. I was sick of crowds, traffic, phones buzzing all the time. I packed my gear, checked my map a dozen times, made sure I had a solid GPS device, emergency whistle, satellite phone, and enough food for 4 days even though I planned for just 3. I carried a tent, small stove, water filter, extra batteries, and everything I'd ever needed on longer treks. I wasn't reckless, just tired of people. The drive up was beautiful but long. It took me down gravel roads, through tiny towns with one gas station or none at all. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was halfway down. The trailhead wasn't marked except for a faded piece of tape around a tree. I parked off the side of the gravel, locked the car, stashed the keys in my emergency bag, and started walking. I had about 2 hours of daylight left. My plan was to get about 3 miles in, set up camp at a small clearing I'd seen marked on an old topographic map, and start the loop first thing in the morning. It was quiet, really quiet. Almost immediately I felt the kind of silence that presses in on you. Not peaceful exactly, just complete. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional creak of a tree. I don't usually get nervous when I hike alone. I like the solitude, but something about this place felt off. I tried to shake it. Could have just been my brain adjusting to the stillness. The clearing was there, just as marked. A flat patch of grass tucked between pines. I set up camp, boiled water for some freeze-dried pasta, and sat on a log eating while the last light disappeared. The night came fast. I double-checked my perimeter like I always do, making sure no food was out, hung the bag from a tree a good ways off, and got in my tent. I read for a bit with my headlamp, then turned it off and laid there in the dark, listening. Nothing. Total stillness. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Not to a sound. Just woke up suddenly, alert. My tent was cold and I could see my breath. It had dropped below freezing. I sat up, unzipped the flap, looked out. Darkness, trees, stars. No movement, no sounds. I didn't sleep much after that. Just laid there waiting for dawn. The next day, I packed up and started the loop. It was a wide arc through a heavily forested area, with some elevation gain and an old fire lookout marked at the far end. I planned to spend the night somewhere near that point. The hike started off well. The path, though overgrown in spots, was easy enough to follow, just worn enough underfoot to show me I was on the right track. The trees were so thick in places the light barely made it through. I kept checking my GPS every half hour just to be safe. About 2 hours in, I found what looked like an old structure in the trees. Just a foundation really, concrete and stone, mostly moss-covered and crumbling. Looked like it might have been a ranger station or a cabin once, long ago. There were rusted metal pieces lying around, hinges, what might have been a stove. No signs of life, though. No animals, no birds, not even bugs. The quiet was getting to me again. Around midday, I stopped for lunch near a creek. It was low, just a thin trickle, but cold and clear. I refilled my bottles and used the filter, sat on a rock and ate granola and beef jerky. I kept looking around, like I expected something, but nothing came. Still no animals, not even squirrels. That afternoon, I started feeling like I was being watched. I know how that sounds. It's the kind of thing people say when they're alone in the woods and their brain starts playing tricks. But I've done enough solo hikes to know the difference between nerves and something more. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but that feeling stayed with me for hours. I reached the fire lookout around 5 p.m. It wasn't a tower like I expected, more like a stone foundation and some broken wooden beams. I guess it had collapsed or been dismantled years ago. I set up camp a bit downhill in a patch of flat ground. From up there, I could see for miles. Forest in every direction, dark and endless. That night, I heard something. Real sound this time. A snapping branch. Then another. I sat up, grabbed my headlamp and shined it outside. Trees, mist, nothing moved. I stayed up a long time again, holding my knife in one hand and the whistle in the other. My heart was pounding. Morning came, gray and cold. I packed quickly. The third day was supposed to be the easy leg of the loop. Mostly downhill, a few streams to cross, ending back at my car. I kept my eyes open, glancing behind me often. Around mid-morning, I saw the first real sign that something wasn't right. Footprints, human footprints, on a soft patch of dirt near a bend in the trail. Bigger than mine, boot treads, heading the same direction I was. That alone wouldn't have bothered me much, but I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead. No sign of other hikers, and the prints looked fresh. I kept walking, faster. Every now and then I'd stop and listen. Once I thought I heard movement behind me, but it stopped as soon as I stopped. I started moving as quickly as I could without running. My GPS showed I was still on track. The car was maybe 5 miles away. Then I lost the trail. I don't know how it happened. 1 minute I was on a narrow path, trees close on both sides. The next I was standing in thick brush. I checked the GPS, somehow I'd veered west. I tried to retrace my steps but couldn't find the trail again. Everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, fallen branches. I circled for over an hour. Still nothing. And that feeling of being watched came back, stronger than ever. I decided to keep moving east, toward where the car should be. It was tough going. Thick underbrush, uneven ground, fallen logs. I checked the GPS again. Battery half full. Still tracking. I kept pushing through, but it was getting darker. Too dark for how early it was. Cloud cover, maybe. I slipped once on a patch of moss, caught myself on a stump, kept going. Around 4 p.m., I found something strange. Tarp. Old, dirty, gray-blue, stretched between trees like a crude shelter. Beneath it, a small fire pit, long cold. Nearby, a rusted camp stove and a torn sleeping bag. No signs of life. No gear. Just remnants. Whoever had been here left in a hurry or didn't care to clean up. The woods felt thick around me, oppressive, like the trees were closer than before. I moved on, trying not to think too hard. Around 6 p.m., I finally caught a break. I spotted the gravel road through a thin stretch of trees. Relief hit me hard. I pushed forward, broke through the trees, and there was no car, just an empty patch of gravel. My car was gone. I stood there in shock. I checked the GPS. I was exactly where I'd started. Same coordinates, but the car wasn't there. No tire tracks, no broken glass, just silence. I sat down and tried not to panic. Checked my satellite phone. No signal. Tried again. Nothing. I waited. Tried again. Still nothing. Sun was setting. I had maybe 30 minutes of light. I set up my tent right there. Didn't bother moving. I was too tired, too rattled. That night was the worst. I barely slept. I kept hearing soft sounds outside. Cracking branches, something brushing the tent wall. I didn't dare look. Morning came. I packed quickly and started walking down the gravel road, hoping I'd reach a main road or get a signal. I walked for hours. No cars, no cabins, nothing but forest. Sometime in the afternoon, I heard an engine. I ran to the sound, waving, yelling. A truck came around the bend. An old pickup, 2 guys in the cab. They stopped, asked if I was okay. I nodded, too tired to explain. They let me ride in the bed. We drove for miles until we hit a small town. I called the police, reported the car. They found it 3 days later, dumped outside a town 2 hours away. Windows intact, nothing stolen. My food was still inside. They never found out who took it or why. I haven't gone hiking alone since. It started as a simple plan to disconnect for a few days. I was exhausted from work, drained from being around people too much, and just needed a stretch of time where I didn't have to talk to anyone or check emails or sit in traffic. I had a long weekend coming up, and I decided to go on a solo hike. Nothing extreme, just a 3-day hike through a remote forest trail I had found online. It wasn't a popular spot. That was the appeal. I wanted silence, solitude, and space to breathe. The area was in northern Idaho. I had driven about 6 hours from where I lived in Montana to get there. The trail was called Lost Echo Loop, which I remember thinking was a pretty dramatic name for something that just wound through dense pine and ran alongside a river. According to the map, it curved around and eventually reconnected, forming a rough loop about 27 miles in total. I planned to cover around 10 miles a day and set up camp near the river each night. The parking area was just a small dirt patch off the side of a forest road. There were no other vehicles when I pulled in. I signed into the little trail ledger that was nailed to a post at the start. It felt outdated and kind of eerie, seeing pages from previous hikers dating back over a year, but hardly anything recent. One person had signed in 3 weeks before. That was the most recent entry. I wrote down my name, the date, and my planned return, then clipped the pen back to the string and started walking. The trail started off well-maintained and easy to follow. It was shaded with thick pine overhead, the air cool and fresh, and the silence deep in a way I had missed. I felt good, energized by the rhythm of walking, by being away from everything artificial. The trail gradually narrowed the deeper I went, but it was still easy enough to follow, with markers every few miles nailed into the trees. That first day was uneventful. I kept a steady pace, stopped to eat a sandwich beside the river, and by late afternoon, I found a flat spot off the trail to set up camp. I had a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, and enough food to last the 3 days. After dinner, I sat for a while just listening to the river. It was peaceful and I slept well. The second day started just as calm. I packed up early and got moving before the sun fully cleared the tree line. The trail started climbing a little more, and I had to cross a few narrow footbridges. The forest here was thicker, and the sound of the river began to fade the further I went. Around midday, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. That worried me. I doubled back for about 15 minutes until I finally saw the last marker I had passed, then carefully retraced my steps until I found where I had gone wrong. a faint trail that split off to the left, nearly overgrown, but with a marker half hidden behind some brush. I made a mental note to be more careful. By evening, the trail dipped down into a small ravine. The ground was soft with pine needles, and everything felt damp. I set up camp near a muddy clearing where the river curved back around. This spot didn't feel quite as peaceful. Something about the trees felt off, like they were leaning too close together or had grown too tall and narrow. I tried to brush it off. I was probably just tired. I made dinner, watched the trees for a while, then climbed into the tent. That night was when things shifted. I woke up sometime after midnight to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a slow shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. I lay still, breathing shallow, listening. It moved around the tent once, then stopped. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, just nothing. I waited a long time before unzipping the tent and peeking outside. My headlamp beam flicked across trees and brush, but there was nothing there. I didn't see prints or signs of animals. Nothing was disturbed. I told myself it had probably been a deer or a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. Every small sound made me sit up. I started feeling jumpy and over alert. I kept the headlamp on and the zipper partially open so I could listen better. By the time the sky began to lighten, I was already packed up and ready to get moving. Day 3 felt different. The air was still, heavier somehow, and everything was too quiet. Even the birds weren't making much noise. The trail was harder to follow now, overgrown in places and marked less clearly. I kept having to stop and check the map. I didn't have cell service, but I had downloaded an offline map of the area on my GPS app. The signal was patchy though, and sometimes it froze or jumped around. I started getting a nagging sense that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Around noon, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A boot, just one. Old, worn, and soaked through, sitting half buried in the mud on the side of the trail. It wasn't recent. Moss had started growing on the leather, but it felt wrong somehow, like it had just been left there. No sign of the other one. No torn pack or ripped fabric. Just the boot. I stared at it for a long time before moving on. I kept walking for hours, convinced I was nearing the loop that would take me back toward the car. But the terrain didn't match the map anymore. The river was further away than it should have been, and the forest was growing thicker again. Around mid-afternoon, I hit what looked like an old logging road. It wasn't on the map. It cut across the forest like a scar, overgrown and lined with brush. I had to decide, follow this new road or backtrack. I didn't like either option. I followed the logging road. It was wider, easier to walk, and I hoped it might lead to a trailhead or a service road. But the further I went, the more wrong it felt. It didn't lead downhill the way I thought it would. It climbed higher, winding through dense trees, until the sun was almost gone. I was out of energy and getting cold. I found a patch of semi-flat ground off the road and pitched the tent again. That night was worse. The noises came back. First twigs snapping, then soft steps. Not animal footsteps, too slow, too deliberate. Like someone walking barefoot. I held my knife the whole night, barely blinking. I kept the tent zipped but didn't dare turn on my light. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know exactly where I was. When morning came, I didn't eat. I just packed up and started walking fast. I followed the road until it dead-ended into a rocky clearing. Nothing but brush and steep terrain beyond. I turned around and ran most of the way back until I found a break in the trees that sloped downward. No trail, no markings, just a steep descent through rough forest. I took it. I slid, tripped, crawled downhill for hours. I scraped my arms, tore my pack, lost my footing more than once. Around mid-afternoon, I finally heard the river again. I forced my way through the last stretch of trees and nearly collapsed when I saw it. I followed the river downstream for what felt like forever, not caring where I was as long as I kept moving. Eventually, I saw a bridge, a real bridge, wooden, wide enough for a truck, and clearly maintained. I made my way to it and followed the dirt road past it. A few hours later, I came to a small campground, the kind with a pit toilet and a map board. There were 2 parked trucks. I didn't see anyone around, but I didn't care. I collapsed on the bench near the map board and just breathed. I hitched a ride back to my car the next morning with a man who was coming into the forest to fish. He was friendly, didn't ask too many questions. When I told him I had gotten lost, he said that part of the forest was tricky and not a lot of people went there anymore. When I finally got back to the trailhead, my car was untouched. I looked at the trail ledger again. My name was still the last one listed. I've thought about that trip almost every day since. I didn't see anything supernatural. I didn't find bones or hear voices. But something was wrong out there. Something that didn't want me there. I don't know if it was a person or just the forest itself, but it didn't feel empty. And I know for a fact I wasn't alone that second night. I still hike, but I stick to well-traveled trails now. I tell people exactly where I'm going. I leave detailed plans, and I never, ever ignore that feeling when the forest goes quiet and the air gets too still. Because I've learned that when it feels like something's watching you out there, it probably is. I've been wanting to do a long solo hike for a while, not one of those quick afternoon trails. I'm talking days in the wilderness, just me, nature, and nothing else. I'd already done a few solo weekend hikes around Indiana and Kentucky, but I wanted something bigger, so I picked a stretch of trail that ran through the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. It wasn't too popular, which was what I liked. Fewer people, less noise. I planned to be out there for 5 days. The trail was called Bald River Gorge. It wasn't super remote, but parts of it went deep into the backcountry. I packed enough for 6 days just in case something went wrong. Tent, water filter, first aid, plenty of food, knife, a small hatchet, GPS, maps, flashlight, batteries, and my old heavy-duty hiking boots. I also brought bear spray and a whistle. I always over-prepare, especially when going alone. The first day went by without anything strange. I parked near the trailhead early in the morning, locked the car, and started off. The path was peaceful, weaving through tall trees that looked like they had been standing there for over 100 years. The air smelled of moss and bark. I saw a few squirrels, birds, even a deer. I walked around 10 miles that first day, set up camp by a creek, boiled some water, ate a quick meal, and turned in early. The second day started off the same. Quiet, calm. I followed the trail as it curved around small hills, through open meadows, then deeper into the forest. I passed an old fire watchtower around midday. The thing looked abandoned. Rusty stairs, busted out windows. I climbed up out of curiosity and looked out across the forest. Nothing but green rolling hills stretching in all directions. No buildings, no smoke, no people. Just endless trees. That afternoon, the trail got harder. The slope increased and the ground turned rocky. I slowed down, took more breaks. Around 4 p.m., I found a spot off the trail near a ridge and set up camp again. I didn't see a single person all day. Not one. That was fine. It's what I expected. I liked it even. That night, though, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing something moving around outside the tent. Not constantly, but in short bursts. Leaves crunching, a twig snapping, then silence. I sat up a few times and listened. I even unzipped the tent once and shined my flashlight around. Nothing. I figured it was a raccoon or maybe a fox. Animals move around at night. That's normal. Day 3 is when things started to feel off. I woke up just after sunrise and noticed that a few of my things had been moved. My backpack, which I always zip up and leave right outside the tent flap, was about 2 feet away from where I'd left it. The top flap was unbuckled. Nothing was missing, but that bothered me. I'm careful about how I set up camp. I always put things in the same place so I can find them in the dark. I told myself maybe I just didn't remember it right. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling. I packed up quickly and got moving. The trail narrowed that day and started climbing again. I passed a waterfall in the late morning and stopped there for a break. Ate some trail mix, filtered more water, and sat with my boots off for a bit. That's when I noticed something strange. Across the water, on the opposite side of the creek, I saw what looked like a boot print in the mud. It wasn't mine. I hadn't crossed over. The print was fresh. The edges were still moist. It was a little bigger than my boot. That was the first time I realized I might not be alone out there. I didn't hear or see anyone else the rest of that day. I kept hiking and ended up going further than I planned just because I didn't want to stop. Something about that boot print just unsettled me. I finally made camp near a patch of large boulders. I set up the tent in a flat spot between two of them, thinking it might help block wind. That night, I cooked over my little stove instead of building a fire. I didn't want to draw attention, just in case. I slept in short bursts. Every little noise outside kept waking me. At one point, I thought I heard breathing. Not close, but steady, like someone standing just a few feet away. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. Then it started again, further off. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up around 6 in the morning. It was still a little dark, but I didn't want to wait. I packed up fast, skipped breakfast, and got back on the trail. My body was sore, but I was moving quicker than before. I had this constant feeling like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, stopping to listen, scanning the woods with my eyes. Nothing, just trees and more trees. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just paranoid. But around mid-morning, I came across another boot print. This one was right in the middle of the trail, heading the same direction I was. Again, bigger than mine. I didn't hear anyone ahead of me, no signs of life. I kept going, but now I was fully on edge. Around lunchtime, I stopped to rest under a cluster of trees. I sat on a fallen log, ate a protein bar, and tried to calm down. That's when I noticed something hanging from one of the lower branches. It was a piece of string tied in a loop, just dangling there. It looked old and weathered, like it had been there a while. But what bothered me was how deliberate it looked, like someone had put it there on purpose. I didn't stay long. I moved faster after that. I hiked for hours without stopping, just trying to put distance between me and whatever was out there. I don't know what I was afraid of exactly. It wasn't like I'd seen anyone, but that feeling stuck with me. Late in the day, I took a wrong turn. It was my fault. I missed a marker and followed what looked like a trail, but it wasn't. It led me down into a shallow ravine filled with brush and fallen trees. I realized the mistake after about 20 minutes, but instead of going back the way I came, I decided to cut across and try to reconnect with the trail on the other side. That was a bad idea. The forest was thick, no clear path, lots of uneven ground. My GPS started to glitch out, bouncing my location all over the place. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself, but everything looked the same. I spent over an hour trying to find the trail again. Finally, I saw what looked like a marker on a tree and followed it, but it led to another dead end. The sun was dropping fast. I had no choice but to set up camp in the middle of the woods with no clear trail nearby. I picked the flattest spot I could find and set up my tent, trying to stay calm. I ate a cold dinner and lay down, but I didn't sleep much. That night, I heard footsteps, not animal ones, human ones, crunching through the brush, slow and deliberate. They circled the tent once, then stopped. I held my knife in my hand and didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, listening. Nothing happened. No attack, no voice, just silence. In the morning, I packed everything in record time and started walking. I didn't even care what direction. I just wanted to find the trail. After about 3 hours of wandering, I stumbled back onto it. I nearly cried from relief. I checked my GPS and confirmed I was about 15 miles from the trailhead. I didn't stop. I hiked all day, barely eating, barely drinking. Every snap of a branch behind me made my heart race. I kept thinking about those prints, the breathing, the footsteps. I started to feel like maybe I'd been followed since the second night. Maybe even longer. I just hadn't noticed. I reached the trailhead around 7 p.m., just before sunset. My car was still there. No damage. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't even change out of my boots. I drove for 2 hours before stopping at a gas station. When I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized my own face. My eyes looked hollow. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? That someone might have followed me? There was no proof. No photos, no stolen gear, nothing. Just a few boot prints and a loop of string. But I know what I felt out there. I've done plenty of hikes since, but never alone. never that deep. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm in the woods. That feeling of being watched, that quiet, steady breathing in the dark. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were there, and I know I was lucky to get out when I did. I took a week off work in late September to do something I had wanted to do for years. Just disappear into the woods for a few days. No phone, no noise, no traffic, no internet. Just the trees, the trail, and me. I had planned it all out well in advance. My route would start at a lesser-known trailhead in northern Colorado, loop through the Roosevelt National Forest, and bring me back around in 5 days. I had marked water sources, packed food for 6 days, and checked the weather, clear and cool, with highs in the 60s and lows dipping into the 30s at night. Perfect. I got to the trailhead just after sunrise. My car was the only one in the gravel lot, which felt like a good sign. I locked it up, slung my 45-pound pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first day was uneventful but beautiful. The trail twisted through pine groves and open meadows that were just beginning to lose their green. I made about 12 miles before setting up camp near a small creek. I boiled water for freeze-dried lasagna and watched the sunset bleed through the trees. That night was cold, but not unbearable. I'd done colder trips before. The next morning I woke up a little stiff, but eager to keep going. After oatmeal and coffee, I packed up and hit the trail again. The second day's route led me deeper into the forest. I crossed only one other trail, which looked unused, almost overgrown. I kept to my path, though, because I had already committed to a loop that was supposed to get me back to the car by day 5. About 10 miles in, I stopped for lunch beside a rocky outcrop that gave me a decent view of the valley below. As I ate, I thought I saw movement down in the trees, just a flicker, maybe an animal. I wasn't sure. I brushed it off. That night, I camped near a small lake. There was no one else around. I didn't hear a single plane, car, or voice. It was exactly what I wanted. Still, something about that second night unsettled me. It wasn't any one thing I could put my finger on. Maybe it was how quiet everything was. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed to vanish after dusk. I fell asleep around 9 p.m., bundled in my sleeping bag with my bear spray close at hand. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't check my watch because I didn't want to shine my flashlight, but I was sure it was the dead of night. I'd been dreaming. Something about walking through snow with no boots, and my feet were freezing. That wasn't what woke me, though. It was a sound. Faint at first, maybe a branch breaking. I held my breath and listened. Then I heard it again. A second crack. Closer. Could have been a deer, maybe an elk. I knew bears were possible too, but not common in this part of the forest. Still, I stayed still and waited. The sound faded away eventually. I didn't fall back asleep for hours. The next day, day 3, I planned a shorter hike, just under 8 miles, to a saddle ridge that had a flat clearing ideal for camping. I made good time, reaching the spot by early afternoon. I set up my tent and took a short hike around the ridge. From one side, I could see miles of unbroken forest. The other side dropped into a steep canyon with jagged rocks and narrow ledges. I stayed away from the edge. The wind had picked up, and I didn't want to risk slipping. That night was worse. Again, I woke up to noises. This time, it was footsteps. I was sure of it. Heavy, deliberate steps, maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I didn't move. I just laid there, every muscle tense. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't call out. I waited. The steps stopped after what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably less. Then silence. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I packed up and decided to cut the loop short. I had a map and figured I could bushwhack east to intersect with an old fire road that would lead back toward the trailhead. It would take longer, maybe 2 days, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I followed the ridge until I found a slope that looked manageable and started the descent. It was slow going, lots of deadfall, loose dirt, and thorny undergrowth. I slipped more than once, skinning my palms and knees. Around midday, I reached the floor of the canyon and started heading east. I kept checking my compass and trying to stay in a straight line, but the terrain forced me to zigzag a lot. I saw strange signs the farther I went. Old cans, rusted and torn. A boot half buried in mud. Too weathered to guess how long it had been there. A broken rifle stock near a rock face. No bones or bodies, but nothing that should have just been lying around either. The trail wasn't marked, and I hadn't seen any sign of human activity since day one. That night, I found a small hollow under a cluster of boulders and set up camp. I didn't bother with a fire. I ate a cold protein bar and climbed into my sleeping bag fully clothed, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other. I didn't sleep, not even a minute. Something moved out there. I heard it. Footsteps again, slower this time. Then something brushing against tree bark. Then silence. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up without eating and pushed forward. I was sure I'd hit the fire road by mid-morning. I never did. My compass said east, but I couldn't find any landmarks that matched my map. I climbed a tall boulder and scanned the horizon. Just trees. No towers, no roads, no smoke. I knew I should have turned back or stayed put, but I didn't. I just kept walking. By mid-afternoon, I knew I was in trouble. My water was low. I hadn't eaten a real meal in over 24 hours. My legs were weak, my hands scraped raw, and I kept thinking I heard someone or something behind me. Not close, just far enough that I couldn't get a clear look. I'd stop and stare back down the trail, but nothing moved. That night, I didn't bother with a tent. I was too tired to set it up. I just wrapped myself in my emergency blanket under a tree and tried to rest. It was cold. I shook all night. No footsteps this time, just cold. Day 5, I knew I had maybe one more day in me before dehydration got serious. I hiked hard, ignoring the pain in my feet and the hunger gnawing at my stomach. Around midday, I stumbled into a clearing and found an old logging road, mostly grown over but still walkable. I followed it. An hour later, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in days. A vehicle. I started running, waving my arms like a maniac. A rusted red pickup truck rounded the bend, hauling logs. The driver stopped, stared, then waved me over. I couldn't speak at first. I just climbed into the bed of the truck and sat there, shaking. He drove me down the mountain to a ranger station. They gave me water, food, and a ride back to my car. It was still there, untouched. I didn't tell them everything, just said I got lost and ran out of supplies. I didn't mention the footsteps or the rusted gear deep in the woods. I didn't want to sound crazy. I still hike, but never alone anymore. And I never stray from marked trails. Something's out there. Not a ghost or a monster, just something dangerous, human or not. And I never want to get that close to it again. It was a cold morning in late October when I decided to take a hike alone. The forest near my town was starting to change colors. The leaves had turned from green to a mix of bright yellows, oranges, and reds. I needed time away from everything. Work was stressful. Life was noisy. I wanted to clear my head, get some fresh air, and maybe enjoy some solitude before winter fully set in. I packed my backpack the night before, taking only the essentials. A couple of water bottles, a small first aid kit, some snacks, a map, and my phone. I had learned to be cautious on solo hikes, so I made sure to tell a friend where I was going and when I expected to return. The trail I chose was about 15 miles long, winding through dense woods and rising up a modest mountain. It was a trail I had taken before, but only in groups. This time, I wanted to try it by myself. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., before the sun had risen. The air was crisp, almost biting. I put on my hiking boots, laced them tight, and slipped on a warm jacket. The forest was quiet except for the faint rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. I started walking just as the sky was turning pale with the first light of day. At first, the trail was easy. The path was clear, covered with soft dirt and fallen leaves. The trees towered above me, their branches stretching wide like arms. I could smell the damp earth and the sharp scent of pine. The air was fresh and cold, making me breathe deeply. I moved steadily, my boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. I kept my pace even, making sure not to tire myself too early. My backpack felt heavy but manageable. Every now and then, I stopped to look around. The woods were beautiful, bathed in soft morning light. Sunbeams broke through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. Occasionally, I spotted a squirrel darting up a tree or a bird flitting between branches. After about 2 hours, I reached the base of the mountain. The trail started to climb steeply here. The soil was rockier, and the air grew thinner. I took my first real break, sitting on a large rock beside the path. I drank some water and ate a small sandwich. My legs felt a little tired but strong. I looked up and saw the trail zigzagging ahead, disappearing between the trees. As I stood up and started climbing again, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and thicker. The path narrowed and became uneven. Roots twisted out of the ground, making the trail tricky to walk. The smell of moss and wet earth was stronger here. I could hear the distant sound of a stream running somewhere nearby, hidden in the undergrowth. I kept going, careful where I stepped. The sun was higher now, shining through gaps in the trees, making patches of light dance on the leaves. The forest felt quieter, almost too quiet. No birds sang here. No animals moved. I told myself it was normal. The deeper parts of the forest were often still. After about another hour of climbing, I reached a small clearing. It was a wide open space surrounded by tall trees. The ground was covered with dry grass and leaves, soft and thick. I stopped again to rest, feeling my heart beat fast from the climb. I looked around and noticed something strange. There were no signs of animals at all. No tracks in the dirt. No bird nests in the branches. No bugs crawling on the grass. The clearing looked untouched, but lifeless. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I shook the feeling off and decided to keep moving. My goal was to reach the summit before noon and have some time to enjoy the view. The summit was just beyond the clearing, maybe another mile or so. As I moved forward, the trail became less clear. The leaves and grass had covered much of the path. I had to watch carefully where I stepped. Sometimes I lost the trail completely and had to look for the narrowest parts between the trees. The forest was thick here, the branches close together, scraping against my jacket and bag. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the light dimmed. The sun was still out, but it felt like the trees blocked it completely. The shadows were longer and deeper. I stopped for a moment, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. I wasn't scared exactly, but I felt very alone. The forest seemed to close in on me. Every sound was muffled, except for the crunch of leaves under my feet. I checked my phone for the time and saw it was already past 11 a.m. I was almost there. I pushed on, moving slowly but steadily. The path climbed again, and my legs burned from the effort. Then I heard it, a sound that made me stop immediately. It was faint at first, a low rumble or growl coming from somewhere ahead and below. I froze. My heart raced. The sound repeated, louder this time, like something moving quickly through the underbrush. It wasn't a bird or an insect. It sounded alive, heavy, and close. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. I thought maybe it was a large animal, a bear or a pack of wild dogs. I remembered my training to stay calm in the wilderness. I decided to keep my distance and back away slowly. I turned around to leave the clearing and head back down the mountain, but the trail I had come on was no longer visible. The leaves and grass had covered it completely. I looked left and right, trying to find the narrow path, but everything looked the same. Panic began to rise in me. I tried to stay calm and looked for a high point to get my bearings. I climbed a small hill and tried to see the landscape. Through the thick trees, I spotted the valley below and the thin line of the road I had driven on earlier. It was far away, but I could see it. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to figure out my position. The map showed the trail winding along the mountain's edge. I tried to line up landmarks with what I saw, but nothing matched. The forest looked different from the map. It was confusing, and I felt a cold sweat on my back. I decided to trust the compass and head east, hoping to find the road or a familiar part of the trail. I moved carefully, marking trees with small cuts on the bark using my pocket knife. I didn't want to get lost deeper in the woods. After about an hour of walking, the growling sound returned, louder and closer, came from the bushes to my right. I stopped and held my breath. Something was moving fast, breaking branches and snapping twigs. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence. My mind raced. I thought about bears and mountain lions. I knew attacks were rare, but the possibility was terrifying. I slowly reached for my hiking stick, gripping it tightly. The noise stopped suddenly, replaced by silence. I waited, every muscle tense. Then, from behind a thick tree trunk, a large animal stepped out into the clearing. It was a huge black bear. My heart stopped. The bear looked as surprised as I was. It stood on all fours but was massive, its fur thick and dark. Its eyes locked on mine for a moment. I remembered everything I had learned about bears. No sudden moves, don't run, try to appear big. I slowly raised my hiking stick over my head, trying to look larger. The bear took a step back, growling softly. It circled me, sniffing the air. I didn't move, not wanting to provoke it. After a tense minute that felt like an hour, the bear turned and lumbered away into the woods. I exhaled deeply, relief flooding through me, but the experience left me shaken. I realized I was far from safety, and the trail was lost. I had to find my way back before dark. I checked my phone. The battery was low, and there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. The forest was deep and remote. I stuffed it back in my pocket and tried to focus. I followed my compass east again, marking trees as I went. The sun was beginning to sink lower, filtering through the branches in thin, golden beams. Shadows stretched long and dark. I kept walking, but the terrain grew harder. The ground was uneven and slippery with moss. Roots tangled everywhere, making each step dangerous. My legs were sore, and my breathing heavy. I drank some water and ate a small snack. I reminded myself to stay calm and think clearly. After several more hours, I spotted a faint trail. It was narrow and overgrown, but definitely a path. My heart leapt. I followed it carefully. The trail twisted through the woods, eventually leading to a small stream. I knelt and drank some cold water, washing my face. The sound of the running water lifted my spirits. I felt hope. I continued along the stream, walking downhill. The forest grew lighter, and I could hear distant sounds. Birds, insects, the rustle of small animals. Finally, as twilight fell, I broke through the trees and saw a dirt road ahead. It was the road near my car. I was safe. I walked quickly along the road, exhausted but relieved. The headlights of a car appeared in the distance. I waved my arms until it slowed and stopped. The driver, a man on his way home, gave me a ride back to my car. I thanked him quietly, grateful beyond words. As I drove away from the mountain, I felt a deep sense. I never thought a day hike could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I'd done plenty of hikes before, alone and with friends, and always made it back just fine. This time, I was confident. I planned it carefully, packed enough water, snacks, a map, compass, and my phone with GPS. I told a friend where I was going, gave her an expected return time, and set off early in the morning. The trailhead was at the base of a long ridge, part of a state park in the mountains not far from my town. The weather was perfect. Clear blue skies, crisp fall air with just a slight chill. The forest around me was a mix of towering pines and maples with bright orange and red leaves. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the scent of pine needles filled the air. The path was narrow but well marked with faded trail markers painted on tree trunks every few hundred feet. First, everything felt normal. The gentle uphill slope made my legs warm, and the steady crunch of leaves under my boots was calming. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and somewhere off in the distance, I heard the faint sound of a creek. I paused a few times to take photos of the view and sip water. The ridge promised a beautiful overlook near the top, and I looked forward to the view. About 2 hours in, I reached a clearing where the trees thinned out and I could see the valley below. The sight was stunning, a sea of autumn colors stretching as far as I could see. I sat on a fallen log, ate some trail mix, and checked my phone. The signal was weak but enough to see the map and confirm my location. According to the GPS, I had followed the main trail exactly. Feeling good, I decided to push on toward the summit. That's when things started to feel off. The trail ahead was still marked, but the paint on the markers was more faded, almost non-existent. I kept my eyes peeled but found myself second-guessing whether I was still on the right path. The forest grew denser here, the trees closer together, and the canopy thickened enough to dim the sunlight. The temperature dropped a bit, and the air became damp with the scent of moss and wet earth. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe the trail markers were old, but I stayed alert using my compass and map. After about 30 minutes, I came to a fork in the trail. The map showed the trail should curve right here and continue uphill. The right fork looked faint and barely used, with a few broken branches and more leaves covering the ground. The left fork was wider and seemed used more often, with a few footprints and clearer ground. It didn't make sense. The wider path wasn't on my map. I hesitated. I decided to trust the map and take the right fork. The path was harder to walk, with rocks and roots sticking out, but I pushed forward. The woods grew even darker, the silence heavier. No birds, no rustling animals, just my footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After another 20 minutes, the trail disappeared altogether. No markers, no clear path, just trees and underbrush. I stopped and looked around. My GPS still showed a trail, but the arrow pointed somewhere off to my right, through thick trees. I was sure I had taken the right fork, but now I was lost. I started to feel the first real panic of the day. I checked my phone again. Battery was at 65%, still enough to last a while, but the GPS signal was weak and jumping. I tried to retrace my steps back to the fork, but the underbrush was thick, and my footprints were already fading on the leaf-covered ground. The forest felt claustrophobic. Every direction looked the same, endless trees and shadows. I stopped to catch my breath and thought hard about what to do next. The sun was now halfway down, and I was still far from the summit. I was supposed to be back at the trailhead by now. I tried calling my friend to let her know I might be late, but no signal. I knew the best option was to backtrack carefully, but I was afraid of going in circles. I decided to mark the trees as I moved, scratching marks into bark with my knife. I moved slowly, trying to keep my orientation. An hour passed like this. Every time I thought I saw a path, it disappeared into thickets. My legs grew tired, my boots heavy with wet leaves. The air turned colder, and a light mist began to rise from the forest floor. The silence deepened, no birds, no animals. Just me, the dark forest, and the growing shadows. As twilight crept in, I felt something else, unease, almost like being watched. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept telling myself to stay calm, focus on survival. My water was running low. I drank slowly, rationing. My phone battery dropped to 40%. I needed to find my way back soon or find a safe spot to wait for morning. Suddenly, I spotted a narrow animal trail heading downhill. It was faint but clear enough to follow. I didn't know where it led, but it was the only option. I followed it cautiously. The trail led me down steep slopes, past fallen logs covered with moss, around thick bushes. I slipped a few times, my hands scraping bark and dirt. After about 40 minutes, I reached a small creek. The water was clear, cold, and flowing gently. Relief washed over me. I knelt to drink and filled my bottle carefully. The sound of running water steadied my nerves. I decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to a road or campsite. The creek was a natural guide. I followed it through the darkening woods. The mist thickened, and the shadows grew long. The forest around me felt ancient, untouched. Broken branches and fallen leaves covered the ground. Every step felt heavier. Then I heard a noise, a faint crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze. My heart raced. I listened hard, but the noise stopped. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. I started walking again, faster this time. The creek curved sharply, and the ground sloped toward a small ravine. I had to be careful not to fall. Minutes later, I saw lights flickering through the trees, maybe from a campsite or cabins. I moved toward the light, hope rising. The lights belonged to a small ranger station at the edge of the park. I called out, but no one answered. The building looked empty, doors locked. I checked my phone, battery at 15%. No signal. I found a trail sign near the station showing a main road about a mile away. It was a clear path. I started walking toward it, using what little light was left. The road was quiet, empty. A few cars passed by far in the distance, their headlights cutting through the dark. I walked for what felt like hours, until finally I reached a parking lot with several vehicles. Relief flooded me. I found my phone signal again and called my friend to come get me. She arrived quickly. I was exhausted, dirty, and sore, but safe. Later, when I looked back at the map, I realized I had taken a wrong fork early on, leading me off the official trail into a maze of unofficial paths and dense forest. The wider, clearer path I had seen at the fork was the correct one, but I had mistrusted it because it wasn't on my map. I had learned the hard way that sometimes the clearest path isn't the one marked on a map or the one that feels right at first. Sometimes, survival depends on trusting what you see and staying calm, even when fear creeps in. That night, safe at home, I thought about how easy it is to get lost in a forest, even with all the modern tools. Nature can be unforgiving, but I was grateful for the creek, for the faint trail, and the distant lights that led me home. Now, I'm more careful when hiking alone. I double-check my routes, keep extra batteries, and never ignore the signs, both on the trail and inside my own head. The forest is beautiful but can be dangerous if you lose your way. I got lucky, but I won't forget that day anytime soon.